My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a senior compliance and risk architect for a top fintech firm in Silicon Valley. Exactly 1 year after going through a brutal divorce, I ran into my ex-husband at a high-end private clinic in Palo Alto. He stood in the crowded hallway, smirking down at me, with my former personal assistant by his side, cradling their 1-year-old son. He looked me dead in the eye and said leaving me was the best decision he'd ever made, because a woman with broken genetics didn't deserve a family.
I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just smiled, looked down at my watch, and waited for the exact moment his fake life shattered into a million pieces. 2 minutes later, a man walked into that hallway, and my former assistant was so terrified she dropped her organic baby bottle right onto the floor.
Before we get to the rest of the story, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if you've ever had to stand tall against toxic people who underestimated your worth. Hit that like button and subscribe. It was a typical rainy winter day in Northern California. I was standing near the third-floor nursing station of an exclusive private clinic attached to Stanford Medical Center, waiting for my father's post-op cardiac bypass reports. I was wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal grey suit and holding my leather briefcase tightly. As a risk architect, my daily job is to tear apart falsified corporate ledgers and track down tens of millions of dollars that disappear for high-net-worth clients. My professional training requires me to maintain zero emotional volatility under extreme pressure, and that training was about to be tested in the most spectacular way.
I turned away from the reception desk with my father's medical file in hand. I had only taken 2 steps down the brightly lit, bustling corridor before my path was aggressively blocked.
Standing right in front of me, taking up the entire width of the hallway, was Julian, my ex-husband. He was 37, wearing an incredibly expensive custom navy Tom Ford suit and sporting a smug expression that made my stomach turn. Standing right next to him was Chloe. She was 28, and up until 2 years ago, she had been my most trusted senior personal assistant. Straddling Chloe's hip, dressed in a designer blue outfit, was a chubby 1-year-old boy. The sheer boldness of this ambush was stunning. I tried to step around them, but Julian shifted his weight to block me again. He wanted an audience. The private clinic hallway was busy with nurses passing by and doctors holding tablets, but Julian didn't care. He wanted a public humiliation.
Well, look who it is, Julian announced loudly, his voice carrying far enough to make a passing nurse turn around. If it isn't my cold, emotionless ex-wife, what are you doing at a clinic, Claire? Did that icy heart of yours finally stop beating?
I stared at him. My resting heart rate remained perfectly steady. I'm here to pick up my father's reports, I replied, my voice completely flat and professional. Step aside, Julian. I don't have time for your childish games. But Julian wasn't about to let this moment go. Throughout our entire marriage, he had tried to diminish me to mask his own deep-seated insecurities. Insecurities stemming from his role as a private equity M and A director who often stole his subordinates' credit to climb the ladder. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me with an expression of malicious victory. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "Oh, you always thought you were above me, Claire," Julian sneered, leaning in closer so the people sitting in the nearby waiting area could hear every word. "You valued your stupid algorithms and risk assessments over giving me a family. You always made me feel like I wasn't enough. But the truth is, you're the one who's broken. You're a barren, useless woman. Look at what I have now. Look at this perfect, beautiful son. Leaving you was the absolute best decision of my life. I got incredibly lucky finding a woman like Chloe who could actually give me a family." Chloe chimed in right on cue. She shifted the baby on her hip and let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She raised her hand to tuck a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, deliberately catching the harsh clinic lights with the massive, custom diamond engagement ring on her finger. "Oh, let it go, Julian," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "It must be so hard for Claire to see us this happy. You know, Claire, I actually feel sorry for you. You spend all your time tracking corporate fraud, but you couldn't even keep your own husband satisfied. You're going to end up old and alone in that cold, empty apartment, while we're out here building a family legacy." She stroked the baby's soft hair, giving me a thoroughly venomous look of triumph. "He just started walking last week," Chloe bragged, her tone sharp and biting. "Julian is such an amazing father. He just bought us a $15 million estate in Atherton, just so the baby could have a massive backyard. That's something you could never give him, because your body is a complete failure." People in the hallway were openly staring now. A few women looked at me with pity. A man pushing a wheelchair shook his head. They were all expecting me to break down. They expected me to drop my files, burst into tears, and flee from this cruel scene, watching my ex-husband and former assistant live a flawless life. They expected a betrayed and fertile ex-wife to shatter completely under the weight of their vicious words. But I am a senior compliance and risk architect. I don't deal in raw emotion. I deal in hard, verifiable facts. And the facts I currently carried in my pocket were about to burn their carefully manufactured happiness to the ground. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't raise my voice or hurl an insult back. Instead, I looked at Julian's smug face, then at the expensive diamond ring on Chloe's finger. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. I reached into my suit jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and looked at the digital time display. It was exactly 10:14 a.m. "Really, Julian?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, but carrying a razor-sharp edge. "You really think leaving me was the best decision you ever made?" Julian frowned, his arrogant smile faltering for a split second. His fragile ego couldn't process why I wasn't crying or begging him to stop. "Yes," he barked, trying to regain control of the exchange. "You're just a bitter, lonely woman, Claire." I smiled, taking a step forward, my eyes locking onto his, completely unfazed by his attempt to break me. "Let's see if you still feel that way in about 60 seconds, I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the tense clinic corridor. "Because the reality of your perfect little family is about to walk right out of those elevator doors." Julian let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. He glanced back at the closed silver elevator doors, then turned back to look at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. He thought I was bluffing. He truly believed I was just a desperate, lonely woman, trying to save face in a public hallway after being completely humiliated. His massive but fragile ego simply couldn't accept the fact that I wasn't crushed. He needed to see me bleed. He needed to break me completely before those elevator doors opened. Julian handed a designer diaper bag to Chloe and took a deliberate, aggressive step forward, invading my personal space. He leaned down, his face just inches from mine. The smell of his expensive cologne, mixed with the sharp, antiseptic scent of the clinic hallway, made me momentarily nauseous. He dropped his voice from a dramatic theatre volume to a low, vicious whisper, designed to cut straight to my core without anyone else hearing. "You've always been delusional and arrogant, Claire," Julian hissed, his eyes narrowing into dark, cruel slits. "Standing here in your cheap business suit, looking at your watch like you still have some kind of control over me. You have nothing. You're a biological dead end. For our entire marriage, I had to pretend that you being broken was acceptable. I had to smile and hold your hand while you cried over a single line on a pregnancy test. But the truth is, you disgusted me. You were a bad investment, a broken, defective asset. Why would a man like me waste his prime earning years on a woman who can't even perform basic biological functions?" Chloe shifted the baby, resting her chin on his soft head, smirking. She didn't show a single ounce of shame for betraying years of professional and personal history with me. She just stood there, basking in the glow of a stolen life built on the ruins of my marriage. Julian wrapped his arms tightly around Chloe's waist, pulling her close to emphasize his point. He wanted to make sure I saw the flawless family unit he had replaced me with. "You thought you were so brilliant during the divorce, didn't you?" Julian continued to whisper, his tone turning manic with frantic pride. "You thought your fancy risk audit skills gave you the upper hand in mediation. You thought you stripped me down to my basic base salary. You sat there in that dreary lawyer's office, making me swear under penalty of perjury that my liquid assets had been perfectly split down the middle. Did you really think that just because you backed my legal team into a corner, I walked away with only a fraction of my wealth?" Julian let out a dark, chilling chuckle. He leaned closer, his hot breath brushing against my cheek. "I played you, Claire," he bragged, completely blinded by his own arrogance, making his fatal mistake. I made absolute fools out of you and your high-priced divorce lawyers. You think an M&A director at a top Silicon Valley private equity firm just lives on a standard salary? You think I bought that $15 million estate in Atherton with a conventional mortgage? Months before I ever handed you the divorce papers, I locked down millions of dollars in executive bonuses. I funneled the money through hidden channels, right under your supposedly all-knowing compliance architect nose. I hid a cool $12 million in cash to ensure my real family enjoyed the luxury they deserve, while you were left begging like a pauper for the crumbs in our joint checking account. The cruel insults about my body and infertility evaporated entirely into the sterile clinic air. My emotional processing systems shut down completely, and the cold clinical machine of the risk architect in my brain kicked into overdrive. Julian thought he was delivering a devastating emotional blow to a heartbroken ex-wife. Instead, he had just handed me a verbal confession to severe financial crimes. My mind began working at the speed of light, cross-referencing every single financial disclosure document Julian had submitted during our divorce mediation a year ago. Under penalty of perjury, he had sworn to a family court judge that his annual total compensation was capped at $600,000. He had sworn there were no external bonuses, no hidden portfolios, and no offshore-routed accounts. But a $15 million Atherton property, even with a minimal down payment, would require at least $3 million in clean liquid cash just to secure the deed. Add to that Chloe's massive diamond ring, the designer baby clothes, and the luxury vehicles they were undoubtedly driving. The meth didn't just look suspicious. The meth was a neon sign flashing criminal perjury. To bypass my divorce attorney's intense scrutiny, Julian would have had to launder those executive bonuses through shadow accounts. If he was hiding money on that scale, he had to be utilizing his executive privileges at the private equity firm. He had just admitted to concealing assets, tax evasion, and lying under oath in a federal family court.
He had handed me the thread to unravel his entire existence.
I categorized every syllable that left his mouth, locking the confession away in a mental vault. I looked at his triumphant face. He was smiling so hard the wrinkles crinkled around his eyes. He felt completely invincible. He had successfully discarded his infertile wife, upgraded to a younger model, secured a male heir, and financially outsmarted a senior risk architect. He truly believed he was the untouchable king of his pathetic little universe. "You really shouldn't have told me that, Julian," I whispered back, my voice carrying an absolute chilling finality. "Because perjury isn't a civil dispute. It's a federal felony." Julian laughed again, rolling his eyes as he stepped back. "Oh, save it, Claire," he scoffed, waving a hand dismissively in the air. "Go call your lawyers. Tell them I was bragging in a clinic hallway. There is absolutely no paper trail. You have zero proof. I covered my tracks flawlessly. You're just making pathetic, empty threats because you know you lost everything, and I won." He looked at Chloe, his smile widening as she giggled and kissed the baby's chubby cheek. He was so incredibly focused on his perceived victory that he didn't even notice the heavy mechanical hum of the elevator arriving directly behind him. He didn't hear the crisp electronic chime that signaled my 60 seconds were officially up. He just stood there, waiting to watch me walk away defeated, completely unaware that an absolute nightmare was waiting for him on the other side of those silver doors. The crisp electronic chime echoed sharply down the tense clinic hallway, breaking the sterile quiet. The heavy silver elevator doors slid open with a smooth mechanical hiss, perfectly timed with the expiration of my 60-second countdown. Julian didn't turn around immediately. He was too busy basking in his self-made triumph, too hyper-focused on watching the reaction on my face to care about who was stepping out of the elevator behind him. But the sudden shift in the air pressure of the hallway was impossible to ignore. Stepping out of the elevator cab was my older brother, Marcus. He was a massive, imposing figure, standing 6'3" and built with a commanding presence. He was wearing a razor-sharp black suit that perfectly matched his lethal professional reputation. Marcus wasn't just my brother. He was a veteran special agent with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, specializing in cross-border financial fraud involving money laundering and tax evasion. He carried the kind of authority that instantly quieted a room the moment he stepped into it. He moved with absolute predatory purpose, his deep eyes completely locked onto the back of Julian's head. But Marcus wasn't alone. Walking side by side with him was Victor, the founder of Velo. If Marcus represented the crushing weight of the federal legal system, Victor represented the volatile, terrifying power of untouchable wealth. Victor was the founder and CEO of Silicon Valley's most prominent AI logistics unicorn. He was dressed in a deceptively casual but staggeringly expensive Brunello Cucinelli cashmere sweater, and on his wrist was a Patek Philippe complication watch that cost more than Julian's base salary for 5 years. He was also the single most lucrative and highest priority client at Julian's private equity firm. For the past 3 years, Julian had practically crawled on his hands and knees to appease Victor, frequently bragging to outsiders about how he personally managed the AI billionaire's offshore venture funds in Silicon Valley. But Victor did not look pleased today. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his neck were visibly throbbing against his white collar. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might shatter under the pressure. But the most chilling detail was his focus. Victor wasn't looking at Julian. His rage-filled eyes were locked dead onto Chloe and the baby boy she was holding on her hip. The heavy, rhythmic thud of their expensive leather shoes, striking the clinic's linoleum floor, finally forced Julian to turn around. He spun on his heel, a look of interrupted annoyance on his face. But the moment his eyes registered who was standing directly behind him, the arrogant smirk vanished instantly.
His entire posture crumbled. The cruel, vengeful ex-husband transformed in an instant into a desperate, groveling corporate executive, a man who had just been caught red-handed by his most vital client. "Victor," Julian stammered, his voice rising in a pitch of forced, over-eager surprise. He practically shoved Chloe to the side so he could step forward and extend his hand. "What an unexpected surprise. What are you doing at Stanford Medical? If you needed me to review the quarterly portfolio reports, you could have just called my personal cell. I would have come straight to your office."
Victor completely ignored Julian's outstretched hand. He didn't say a single word. He just stood there, radiating a lethal, aggressive energy, looking right past Julian's shoulder at the woman holding the child. Chloe's reaction was immediate and entirely catastrophic. The smug, condescending smirk that had been plastered on her face just moments before melted away like wax near an open flame. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified, hollowed-out ghost. Her eyes darted frantically between Victor and the heavy manila envelope Marcus was holding in his hand. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. She knew exactly why Victor was here. The complex web of lies she had spun to secure a $15 million house and a life of luxury was unraveling right before her eyes. Julian looked confused, his hand dropping awkwardly back to his side. He looked at Victor, then at Marcus, his brow furrowed as he tried to comprehend why an IRS criminal investigator was standing side by side with his wealthiest client. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. Marcus closed the final distance between them, stepping directly into Julian's personal space. He loomed over my ex-husband, forcing Julian to tilt his neck back just to meet his eyes. Marcus didn't offer a polite greeting. He didn't ask Julian how he was doing. He moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a federal executioner, delivering a lethal blow. Marcus raised his right hand, holding the thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. With a sudden, aggressive motion, he slammed the heavy envelope flat against the center of Julian's chest. The sound of the thick paper striking Julian's expensive suit echoed down the entire clinic hallway. The physical impact forced Julian to take a stumbling step backward, his hands instinctively flying up to catch the envelope before it hit the floor. "What the hell is the meaning of this, Marcus?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and rising panic as his fingers gripped the edges of the paper. "You can't just walk up and assault me in a public medical facility. What kind of game are you and Claire playing?" "I'm not playing any games, Julian," Marcus replied, his deep baritone booming with absolute legal authority. His tone carried clearly down the corridor, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. That envelope contains a legally binding federal grand jury subpoena regarding a comprehensive investigation into money laundering and corporate fraud. You have been officially served. I suggest you open it right now, because the information inside is going to permanently alter the trajectory of the rest of your life. Julian stared at Marcus, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked down at the heavy envelope in his hands, the official seal of the United States federal government stamped clearly on the flap, mocking his fragile ego. He couldn't comprehend how a routine morning meant to harass his ex-wife had suddenly escalated into being served with federal legal documents.
Slowly, his fingers slid under the seal and tore the envelope open.
Behind him, the final breaking point arrived. Chloe could no longer maintain the illusion. The absolute pure terror of facing the reality of her actions overrode her body's motor functions. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as she looked into Victor's furious eyes. The heavy glass baby bottle she had been holding slipped straight through her manicured nails. It plummeted toward the ground, striking the hard linoleum floor of the clinic with a loud, sharp shatter. The cap shattered on impact, and a massive spray of white formula erupted across the hallway. The liquid splashed violently against the polished floor, pooling around the tips of Julian's expensive Italian leather shoes. The loud pop of the shattering bottle broke the remaining silence of the hallway, causing both the child and Chloe to let out a startled, piercing cry. The absolute nightmare I had promised had officially arrived, and it was about to burn their perfect little world to ash. Julian stared at the spilled white liquid soaking into the stitching of his Italian leather shoes. The baby's piercing cries echoed off the sterile walls, but Julian didn't move to comfort his supposed son. His eyes were glued to the first page of the medical and text documents, his hands shaking so violently the paper rustled audibly in the quiet hallway. He scanned the dense medical terminology, his brain completely unable to process the catastrophic information laid out in front of him. He looked up at Marcus, his face twisted into a mask of confused, frantic denial. "What is this garbage?" Julian spat, waving the papers in the air, his voice cracking. "This is a joke. This is some kind of sick document Claire fabricated out of jealousy. You think you can scare me with fake hospital records?" Marcus didn't flinch. He reached out with lightning speed and snatched the documents right back out of Julian's trembling hands. "Sir, since your reading comprehension seems to degrade under pressure, let me translate it for the entire hallway," Marcus said, his deep voice projecting the absolute authority of a federal courtroom. He hadn't shown up here by accident. 2 months ago, while tracking Julian's offshore accounts, I had breached his firm's insurance compliance portal, intercepted a definitive medical report, and quietly turned it over to Marcus. Marcus flipped to the second page, holding it up so the official laboratory letterhead was clearly visible.
4 months ago, your private equity firm mandated a comprehensive executive, physical and biometric screening for a newly upgraded $50 million Keyman corporate life insurance policy, Marcus announced, ensuring every single person in the corridor could hear him. Those blood samples were routed to a federally certified diagnostic facility. The screening flagged a severe genetic anomaly. It triggered an automatic secondary review under federal medical guidelines.
Julian swallowed hard, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "My blood work was fine," he stammered, taking a half step back. "I'm perfectly healthy." "Your cardiovascular health is fine, Julian," Marcus corrected, looking down at my ex-husband with eyes like chips of black ice. "But your reproductive system is fundamentally non-existent. Genetic sequencing confirmed the presence of a rare, irreversible chromosomal microdeletion. Courtesy of the illegal underground biohacking drugs and experimental peptide hormones you abused in your 20s to maintain that toxic Silicon Valley hustle. You have absolute azoospermia. You produce 0 viable reproductive cells. You never have. You are 100% permanently sterile, Julian. It is physically impossible for you to ever father a child." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. A passing nurse stopped in her tracks. Patients in the waiting area stared in absolute stunned silence. I stood perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in front of my suit jacket, watching the exact moment Julian's entire fabricated reality was violently annihilated. For years he had tortured me. He had gaslit me into believing my body was a defective failure. He had watched me cry over negative pregnancy tests, secretly gloating in his own imagined superiority. But the medical truth was finally exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the clinic. I was never the problem. Julian was the biological dead end.
"No," Julian whispered, shaking his head frantically. The denial was so deep it bordered on temporary insanity. "No, that's a lie. That's clinically impossible." He pointed a trembling finger at the crying infant in Chloe's arms. "Look at him. That's my son. Chloe and I conceived him naturally. She gave me the family Claire couldn't. You made this up to destroy me."
Marcus didn't say another word. He simply stepped back, letting the real father take the floor. Victor stepped forward. The sheer weight of his fury seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the hallway. He didn't look at Julian. He walked straight up to Chloe. Chloe was now openly weeping, clutching the wailing baby tightly against her chest, as if the child could shield her from the oncoming destruction. "Tell him, Chloe," Victor commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl that promised absolute financial and social ruin. "Tell your pathetic husband exactly whose DNA is running through that boy's veins." Chloe sobbed violently, shaking her head from side to side, unable to form a coherent sentence. Her carefully constructed trophy wife facade had completely collapsed. Victor turned his burning gaze onto Julian. "You arrogant, ignorant idiot," Victor spat, the words hitting Julian like a physical blow. "You spent the last 3 years licking my boots like a dog, trying to manage my venture portfolio. You invited me to dinners at your tacky country club. You bragged to me about your beautiful new girlfriend. And while you were busy playing the big shot M&A director, she was showing up at my penthouse apartment. She knew my net worth was 10 times yours. She wanted a bigger ATM. Julian's jaw dropped, his eyes darting frantically between Victor and Chloe. "Chloe," Julian gasped, his voice sounding tiny and broken. "What is he talking about? Tell him he's lying."
"She was sleeping with me behind your back for 6 months, Victor continued, completely ignoring Julian's pathetic pleading. "She got pregnant and realized she could play both sides of the chessboard. She put your name on the birth certificate to secure that $15 million Atherton estate and a diamond ring. Then she secretly came to me with a private paternity test,
demanding $50,000 a month in untraceable Bitcoin transfers to keep my name off the public records and avoid a scandal. She used you for stable real estate and me for the genetic lottery." Absolute silence returned to the hallway, broken only by Chloe's loud gasps and the baby's continuous crying. Julian froze. The human brain can only process a certain amount of catastrophic trauma before the logical circuits completely overload and roar. Animalistic rage takes over. Julian realized in one horrific second that his entire life was a humiliating joke. His perfect son was a lie. His beautiful new wife was a manipulative blackmailer, sleeping with his wealthiest client. And he had just, moments ago, loudly bragged about his supposed superiority to his ex-wife. His ex-wife, who was currently standing 10 feet away, watching his destruction with a calm, satisfied smile. A guttural, pained scream tore from Julian's throat. It wasn't a scream of sorrow. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated violence. Julian lunged forward, his hands forming tight fists, flying straight toward Victor's face. He swung a wild, desperate punch, powered by the complete shattering of his massive ego. But Victor wasn't a fragile tech executive. He was built from years of high-stakes tech grinding and early career mixed martial arts training. Victor slipped the clumsy punch with ease, stepping into Julian's guard and driving a brutal clean hook straight into Julian's ribs. The impact knocked the wind clean out of Julian's lungs, but frantic adrenaline kept him moving. He tackled Victor, slamming the wealthy founder hard against the clinic wall. A framed medical poster shattered behind them, raining shards of plastic and paper onto the linoleum. Chloe screamed in absolute horror, backing herself flat against the reception desk to protect the baby. The brawl lasted all of 4 seconds. 3 burly clinic private security guards, who had been hovering near the elevators ever since Marcus arrived, rushed forward. They hit the 2 men like a freight train. 2 guards grabbed Julian by his custom suit jacket, slamming him down onto the floor with extreme force. Julian kicked and struggled, screaming obscenities at Chloe, at Victor, at the entire world. The 3rd guard restrained Victor, pulling him back and ordering him to stand down. I stood precisely where I had started, my leather briefcase held firmly at my side. I looked down at Julian. His expensive navy suit was torn, his tie ripped apart, and his face was pressed flat into the formula-stained clinic floor by a 200-pound guard.
His perfect life had just been violently erased.
And the most beautiful part of this grand spectacle was that my real revenge hadn't even started yet. The heavy silver doors of a second elevator slid open with a soft mechanical chime, completely oblivious to the violent chaos unfolding in the hallway. Stepping into the fluorescent-lit corridor was Eleanor. Julian's 62-year-old mother was dressed in a perfectly tailored Chanel tweed suit, her fingers gripping a brand-new Hermes Birkin bag and a beautifully wrapped gift box from an expensive infant boutique. She had arrived for what was supposed to be a routine pediatric checkup for her beloved grandson. Instead, she walked directly into a war zone. Eleanor froze, her sophisticated designer heels clicking to an abrupt halt on the polished linoleum. Her eyes scanned the wreckage. She saw the shattered plastic baby bottle. She saw Victor glaring at Chloe while straightening his custom silk tie. She saw her son's current wife sobbing against the reception desk, clutching the wailing infant. And then she looked down at the floor. She saw her pride and joy, her perfect, successful, wealthy son, pinned to the ground by a massive security guard, his face pressed into a puddle of spilled milk. For 3 whole seconds, Eleanor simply short-circuited. Her wealthy, pretentious brain could not process this unseemly spectacle, but then her gaze snapped upward, locking directly onto me. In Eleanor's distorted, narcissistic reality, Julian was a flawless being. He was incapable of failure. Therefore, any misfortune that befell him had to be the result of a malicious outside force, and I had always been her favourite scapegoat. Eleanor dropped the expensive gift box. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. She let out a high-pitched, theatrical shriek and charged forward, stepping right past the guards to point a manicured, trembling finger directly into my face. "What have you done, Claire?" Eleanor screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the clinic walls. "Tell these thugs to get their hands off my son this instant. You orchestrated this, didn't you? You twisted bitter woman. You couldn't stand to see Julian happy, so you hired these people to attack him in a high-end clinic." I didn't take a single step back. I looked down at her finger hovering inches from my nose, then looked directly into her frantic eyes. "I didn't hire the clinic security, Eleanor," I replied, my voice perfectly calm, a chilling contrast to her manic hysteria. "Your son attacked another man. They are simply restraining a violent aggressor." Eleanor scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. She turned her venom toward Marcus, who was still holding the federal tax and medical documents. She looked my brother up and down with blatant snobbery, completely ignoring the silver federal badge clipped to his belt. "And you," Eleanor spat, glaring at Marcus. "I always knew your family came from the street thugs, sneaking into a clinic with fabricated, fake documents to terrorize my family. You think printing some medical jargon on a piece of paper is going to convince us my son is broken? Julian is a top-tier male specimen. He is an executive. He comes from the superior bloodlines. Claire is the barren failure. She is the one whose body couldn't fulfill basic biological duties.
She paid you to forge this absolute garbage because she's consumed by jealousy."
Marcus didn't react to her blatant classist insults or racial bias. He simply held up the hospital letterhead. "This is a federal diagnostic report, lady," Marcus stated, his deep baritone cutting through her shrieks. "Your son is absolute azoospermia. He is permanently sterile. The child is not his. If you have an issue with science, you can take it up with the medical board. But screaming at me won't magically rewrite his DNA." "Lies!" Eleanor roared, stamping her foot on the floor like a petulant toddler. "All disgusting, vengeful lies manufactured by a discarded wife who has no purpose to her existence. Eleanor spun around and rushed over to Chloe. She threw her arms protectively around Chloe's shaking shoulders, shielding the sobbing woman and the crying baby from the rest of the hallway. Eleanor glared at Victor, who was watching her with an expression of intense disgust. "Don't listen to them, Chloe," Eleanor cooed, her voice softening into a sickeningly sweet tone as she stroked the baby's head. "We know the truth. Look at this precious boy. He has Julian's strong jawline. He has his eyes. He is my grandson. No one is taking him away from us. These people are just trying to extort us because Julian is incredibly successful." Victor let out a dark, terrible laugh. His rage was momentarily eclipsed by the sheer absurdity of Eleanor's delusion.
"You're just as clinically delusional as your pathetic son," Victor sneered, stepping slowly and deliberately toward the two women. "You want to talk about extortion, lady? Ask the woman you're holding right now about the $50,000 in cryptocurrency she blackmailed out of me last month, just to keep my name off the birth certificate. Ask her how many times she visited my penthouse while your son was at the office. There isn't a single drop of your precious bloodline in that child."
"He is mine." Eleanor clapped her hands over her ears, screwing her eyes shut. "I won't listen to this slander," she screamed, shaking her head violently. "You're a liar. You're all liars trying to steal our joy. Claire put you up to this because she wants half of everything Julian built. She wants to ruin him because he replaced her with a real woman." The guards holding Julian on the floor finally hauled him up to his feet, but kept a vicious grip on his arms. Julian looked like a broken man, his immaculate suit ruined, his breathing heavy and ragged. He looked at his mother, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. "Mum," Julian wheezed, his voice hoarse. Tell them it's a lie." Eleanor rushed to her son's side, ignoring the sharp warnings from the guards to keep her distance. She cupped Julian's face in her hands, pressing frantic kisses against his cheeks. "Of course it's a lie, my sweet boy," Eleanor cried, her hysteria reaching a fever pitch. "You're perfect. You have always been perfect. They are just trying to drag you down to their miserable level. Claire is nothing but a pathetic corporate employee whose salary is pennies compared to yours. She's trying to use this clinic to provoke a lawsuit because she's completely broke." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting steadily at my sides. The pure, unadulterated madness radiating from Eleanor was an absolute masterclass in psychological projection. She was so desperate to protect the fragile illusion of her son's supremacy that she was actively rewriting reality in real time. She refused to accept the biological truth. She refused to accept the testimony of a tech billionaire. She was backing herself into a corner, driven by a malicious elitist pride that simply could not tolerate the concept of failure. Eleanor turned her head back to face me, her face flushed a deep, ugly purple. "You think you won, Claire?" she sneered, her upper lip curling into an ugly snarl. "You think this little circus performance is going to bring down my family? We are untouchable. Julian is a genius. You think you stripped him clean during the divorce, but you're just a blind fool. You have no idea who you're messing with or the kind of power my son truly holds." My eyes locked onto hers. The compliance analysis engine in my brain whirred to life, predicting the exact moment her arrogant hysteria would override her basic survival instincts. I didn't say a single word. I just let her keep talking, waiting for her to dig the very grave her son was about to fall into. Eleanor stepped away from her son, her desperate need to assert her family's dominance, completely hijacking her rational thought process. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and looked down at me as if I were nothing but dirt on the bottom of her expensive heels. The clinic security guards still held a firm grip on Julian's arms, but Eleanor acted as if he was standing on a victory podium. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to inflict maximum financial and emotional damage to prove their Silicon Valley elite bloodline was superior to my career as a risk architect.
She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sterile clinic air, and then unleashed the exact words that would permanently destroy her son's life.
"Oh, you think you're so brilliant, Claire?" Eleanor shrieked, her voice echoing sharply down the hallway, reaching every patient, nurse, and doctor within a 50-foot radius. "Parading around with your little corporate title, looking at your watch like you control the room. You think you backed him into a corner in that mediation room a year ago? You actually believed he walked away with nothing but his base salary? You're an absolute idiot. My son is a financial mastermind. Julian's head snapped up, his eyes widening with a sudden naked terror. His breath caught completely in his throat. Mom, he choked out, his voice a strangled, panicked whisper. Mom, stop. Don't say another word. But Eleanor couldn't hear him over the deafening roar of her own toxic pride. She was too hyper-focused on the twisted satisfaction of shoving my perceived failure directly into my face. He played you, Eleanor boasted, gesturing wildly with her hands. He made absolute fools out of your high-priced lawyers and that stupid family court judge. While you were crying over negative pregnancy tests, he was busy securing his real future. He pulled a cool $12 million straight out of his executive portfolios and transferred it directly into an untraceable Bahamian shadow account. Right under your supposedly brilliant auditing nose. $12 million, Claire. Clean, liquid cash. He hid it flawlessly during the divorce proceedings to ensure his real family was set for life. While you were fighting over crumbs in the joint checking account, he was already buying a $15 million mansion in Atherton. You lost, Claire. You lost everything. The silence that followed her declaration was absolute and terrifying. Even the crying baby seemed to pause for a breath. The mechanical hum of the elevators stopped. The entire hallway felt as though it had suddenly been sucked into a vacuum. Julian went limp in the guard's grip, all remaining colour rapidly draining from his face. He looked at his mother, not with love or gratitude, but with the pure, unadulterated horror of a man who had just watched the executioner pull the lever. "Shut up," Julian whispered, a single tear of pure terror slipping from the corner of his eye. "Oh God, Mom, shut your mouth. You just killed me." I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid and controlled. The information Eleanor had just yelled at the top of her lungs hit my brain like a lightning bolt, instantly illuminating the dark, complex financial web Julian had woven. My forensic auditing instincts shifted into maximum overdrive, rapidly processing the numbers, the timeline, and the corporate structure of his private equity firm. $12 million. Julian was an M&A director. His base salary was $350,000, with performance bonuses that occasionally pushed his total compensation near $700,000 or $800,000. Even if he had saved every single penny of his bonuses over the 7 years of our marriage, it was mathematically impossible for him to have accumulated $12 million in liquid cash to hide in a Bahamian account. It was a statistical impossibility, unless that money wasn't his to begin with. The pieces snapped together with lethal precision. Julian hadn't just concealed marital assets during our divorce. He had used the chaos of our separation and the distraction of the asset division mediation to mask a massive corporate crime. He had utilized his executive access to embezzle client funds, laundering the stolen capital through offshore accounts to bypass internal compliance audits. He had literally robbed the very clients he was supposed to be managing. And standing right next to him, watching this spectacular collapse, was his single wealthiest client. Victor slowly turned his head to look at Julian. The raw, violent fury from the paternity truth was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, predatory gaze. Victor knew the dark web of high finance better than anyone. He didn't need a calculator to realize what Eleanor had just admitted to. $12 million, Victor repeated, the low, dangerous rumble of his voice making Julian visibly shudder. You hid $12 million in the Bahamas at the exact same time my private corporate trust reports showed a $9 million phantom deficit due to what you called market volatility. The same volatility you personally assured me was just a temporary algorithmic glitch. Julian shook his head violently, panic tears streaming down his face. Victor, please, Julian begged, struggling against the guard's hold. She's mistaken. My mother is just talking nonsense. There is no account. I didn't touch your money. I swear on my life, I didn't touch it. You don't have a life left to swear on, Julian, Victor replied, his tone flat and devoid of mercy. You stole my money to buy a house for the woman sleeping in my bed. You used my funds to finance your pathetic delusion. Eleanor finally realized the catastrophic mistake she had made. She looked at Julian's terrified face, then at Victor's lethal expression, and finally turned her gaze to me. The arrogant, smug glow on her features vanished entirely, replaced by a sickening, pale dread. She clapped a manicured hand tightly over her mouth, but it was far too late. The words had been spoken, and they could never be taken back. I adjusted my grip on my leather briefcase. I looked directly at Eleanor, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across my face. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said, my voice perfectly polite, yet razor-sharp. I spent 6 months trying to locate the missing capital from our divorce settlement. I always suspected he had hidden a few $100,000, but I never imagined he was stupid enough to embezzle $12 million of his clients' funds. You just saved my compliance team and Marcus's department hundreds of hours of discovery work. I turned my attention to my ex-husband, whose knees were visibly buckling under the weight of his impending doom. Perjury in a family court regarding hidden marital assets carries heavy fines and potential jail time, I stated clearly, ensuring my voice carried to the clinic guards acting as witnesses. But corporate embezzlement and wire fraud involving a Bahamian offshore account carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I looked back at Eleanor, whose eyes were wide with pure terror. "Oh, you wanted to prove your son was a genius, Eleanor?" I added, my tone dripping with clinical disdain. "Congratulations. You just proved he's a federal criminal, and you provided a verbal confession in a public hallway full of witnesses." Eleanor let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. She stumbled backward, leaning against the wall for support. Her golden boy wasn't just sterile and cuckolded. He was a thief heading straight for a federal cell. And she was the one who had happily handed the government the keys.
Victor didn't wait around for the clinic security to release their hold on Julian. He didn't care about the federal embezzlement charges or the offshore accounts I was already planning to dismantle. Victor operated in a world where money was a tool, but bloodlines and loyalty were the ultimate currency.
He slowly shifted his focus away from the broken, weeping private equity director on the floor, locking his dark, furious eyes onto the woman standing by the reception desk. Chloe was shaking violently. The crying baby was pressed tight against her chest, his little hands clutching the fabric of her expensive designer blouse. She had played the ultimate high-stakes game of deception, believing her beauty and manipulation could easily control 2 wealthy men simultaneously. She had built her $15 million Atherton illusion on a foundation of lies. And now, the architect of her destruction was standing directly in front of her. Victor closed the distance between them with a slow, terrifying precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to scream to command a room. His sheer presence was enough to make Chloe shrink backward until her spine hit the hard edge of the wooden reception counter.
"You really thought you were the smartest person in the room?" Victor stated, his voice low, lethal, and carrying the weight of a death sentence. "You thought you could sleep in my bed, demand crypto transfers to keep my name quiet, and then parade my son around like a trophy in front of this pathetic, sterile thief?"
Chloe sobbed, shaking her head frantically. "Victor, please," she begged, her voice breaking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "I did it to protect him. Julian was losing his mind, and I needed that house to establish stability. I love you, Victor. I've always loved you. The baby needs his real father." The sheer boldness of her lie made Victor let out a sharp, humorless laugh. His eyes narrowed into dark, cruel slits. "You don't love anyone but yourself, Chloe. You're a parasite. You latched onto Julian for the estate, and you latched onto me for the cash. But your little game is officially over." Victor reached into his custom suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, matte black smartphone. He tapped the screen twice, holding it up so Chloe could see the digital display. "As of 20 minutes ago, the 3 offshore crypto wallets I set up for your hidden monthly payments have been completely drained and permanently locked," Victor announced, his tone entirely flat and merciless. "The Centurion black cards you've been using to fund your luxury shopping sprees have been deactivated. You have absolute zero access to any of my funds." Chloe gasped, her eyes widening in pure panic. Oh, you cannot do this, she screamed, her false maternal facade completely vanishing as the reality of her financial ruin set in. I have a child. You cannot cut me off. I will go to the media. I will tell everyone about the hush money.
Okay, go ahead, Victor challenged, tilting his head with a cold, predatory smile. Call the press. Tell them you blackmailed a tech billionaire while being married to a man who embezzled $12 million in client funds. Let us see how much sympathy the public has for a scheming gold digger.
Victor took one final step forward, pointing a sharp, authoritative finger directly at the crying infant. And you will never use my son as a financial hostage again. My legal team filed an emergency ex parte custody motion this morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, the exact moment the federal lab legally verified the DNA results. You are an unemployed blackmailer facing potential criminal conspiracy charges. I am a billionaire with a flawless record. The family court judge will grant me full physical and legal custody of that boy before the weekend is over. No! Chloe shrieked, clutching the baby tighter, causing the infant to wail even louder. No, he is mine! You cannot take him from me. He is all I have left. He is not a paycheck, Victor replied, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. He is my blood, and you will never extort another dime from me using him. My attorneys will be in touch regarding the immediate surrender of the child. Enjoy the Atherton house while you still can, because once the FBI seizes Julian's assets, you will be out on the street.
Victor turned his back on her completely, a total dismissal of her existence. He gave Marcus a brief, respectful nod, adjusted his custom silk tie, and walked toward the elevator bay. He stepped inside, the silver doors sliding shut behind him, leaving the destruction of the clinic corridor completely behind.
Chloe slid down the front of the reception desk, collapsing onto the linoleum floor. She buried her face in the baby's blanket, sobbing uncontrollably. Her entire world, her wealth, her status, her leverage, had been completely vaporized in less than 5 minutes. Julian, who had been pinned to the floor by security watching the entire exchange, suddenly stopped struggling. The frantic panic that had consumed him upon hearing the admission of embezzlement shifted into something darker. The reality of his absolute infertility, combined with the public humiliation of Chloe's betrayal, triggered a severe psychological break. His fragile, arrogant ego shattered completely, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated, vicious rage. Julian lunged upward onto his knees, violently throwing off one of the guards. The guard, caught off guard by the sudden burst of adrenaline, stumbled backward, giving Julian enough room to fling himself toward the reception desk. "You dirty, lying snake!" Julian screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. He pointed a trembling, dust-covered finger at Chloe, who shrank back in terror. "You made me buy that house? You made me spend money on his kid. You sat in our living room and smiled while I bought you diamond rings. You used me." Chloe looked up at him, mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "You deserved it!" she screamed back, her own vicious nature finally breaking to the surface. "You are a broken, defective man, Julian. You could not even give me a real child. You spent your whole life pretending to be a big shot, but you are just a pathetic, sterile thief. Victor is 10 times the man you will ever be." Julian let out a guttural roar. He lunged forward, reaching wildly for Chloe. The remaining 2 security guards tackled him instantly, bringing him face down back onto the hard clinic floor. Julian struggled violently, kicking his legs and screaming obscenities that echoed through the entire corridor. "I hate you," Julian roared, tears of animalistic rage streaming down his face as he struggled under the heavy boots pinning him down. "I will ruin you, Chloe. I will make sure you rot in the gutter. Without my money, you are nothing. You are absolutely nothing." Eleanor stood frozen against the wall, her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her own face as she watched her perfect golden family tear each other apart like wild dogs. The illusion of elite Silicon Valley aristocracy was completely incinerated, replaced by the ugly, vicious reality of their shared greed and deception. I stood perfectly still, my hands neatly folded in front of my blazer, watching the 2 people who had gleefully destroyed my marriage absolutely obliterate each other. They were drowning in the exact toxic flood they had created. And the most satisfying part of the spectacle was that I did not have to lift a single finger to push them in. The violent struggle finally exhausted the last reserves of Julian's frantic adrenaline. The 3 clinic guards managed to drag him backward, forcing him onto his knees against the pale, fluorescent-lit corridor wall. His custom navy blazer was ripped at the shoulder seam. The expensive Italian fabric covered in spilled baby formula and clinic floor wax. He panted heavily, his chest heaving from the exertion, staring blankly at the absolute ruin of his meticulously constructed life. Across the hallway, Chloe was still sobbing, hysterically, curled into a pathetic ball at the base of the reception desk. She refused to look at him, clutching the crying baby to her chest, as the reality of her financial ruin crushed her. Eleanor remained frozen near the shattered medical posters, her hands over her mouth in a silent, horrified state of shock. The elite matriarch who had spent the last 10 minutes screaming about her superior bloodline was now completely mute, watching her golden boy face total destruction. I watched the pathetic scene for 10 more seconds, letting the image burn into my memory permanently. It was a masterpiece of self-destruction. They had walked into this clinic behaving like apex predators, ready to mock and humiliate a sterile ex-wife. Instead, they had blinded themselves into a federal trap and pulled the trigger on themselves. I adjusted my grip on my father's medical review files and my leather briefcase. My role in this public spectacle was officially over. I turned my head and gave Marcus a brief, decisive nod. It was time to leave. I turned my back on the weeping wreckage of the family that had mistreated me and took a firm step toward the silver elevator doors. The sharp, confident click of my high heels on the linoleum seemed to snap Julian out of his traumatized trance. The sudden realization hit him that the woman he had belittled for years, the woman he had gone out of his way to ambush just 20 minutes prior, was walking away with the absolute power to destroy his freedom. The blind rage he had felt toward Chloe vanished instantly, completely replaced by a suffocating, terrifying panic for his own survival. "Claire, wait!" Julian gasped, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate hiss. He shoved his shoulders forward against the muscle fatigue. He managed to wrench his right arm free from the guard's grip, buying just enough time to lunge across the corridor toward me. His fingers clamped onto my forearm, tight and frantic. "Claire, please," Julian begged, looking up at me from his knees, his bloodshot eyes wide with terror. "Please, tell me this is a nightmare. Tell me this is just some twisted game you're playing to scare me. You're so smart, Claire. You can fix this. I'm sorry, okay? I'm so incredibly sorry for the things I said to you today. You know I didn't mean it. I was just angry. We were married for 7 years. You cannot just leave me here. Please, help me." The sheer nerve of him attempting to use 7 years of emotional abuse as a negotiating tactic. He genuinely believed he could appeal to the loving, loyal wife I used to be. But that woman died the day she sat in a lawyer's office, watching him swear that our joint savings were depleted, while he was secretly embezzling client funds to buy a luxury estate for my assistant. I did not flinch at the sudden physical contact. I did not try to violently wrench my arm away or scream for security. I simply looked down at his trembling hand, gripping my custom charcoal blazer, and then I looked directly into his panicked, broken eyes. My resting heart rate remained perfectly steady. I reached out with my free hand, and with surgical, clinical precision, peeled his fingers off my sleeve, one by one. I stepped back, smoothing the wrinkled fabric of my jacket. Our marriage ended the exact moment you decided my worth was entirely dependent on my biology, Julian, I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling finality. I am no longer your wife. I am a senior compliance and risk architect, and you just proudly confessed to perjury during a federal divorce mediation in a public hallway filled with witnesses. Julian shook his head violently, tears of pure horror spilling over his lashes and tracking through the dust on his face. "I can give you half," he whispered frantically, completely ignoring the guards who were moving to pin his arms again. "I will give you $4 million right now, Claire. Clean cash. Just do not call the federal authorities. Do not look into the Bahamas routing numbers. Please take the money and walk away." I smiled, a cold, predatory smile that froze what little blood was left in his veins. "I do not want your dirty money, Julian," I replied, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper that cut straight through him. You committed perjury in our divorce settlement. You concealed $12 million in embezzled corporate funds. I am not just reopening the family court settlement to adjust the asset split. I am going to bankrupt you. My risk compliance team will shred every corporate ledger, offshore trust, and shadow shell company tied to your name. By the time I am done dismantling your empire of fraud, you will not have enough liquid capital left to hire a public defender for your federal embezzlement case. Eleanor finally found her voice, letting out a horrified, high-pitched wail. She lunged forward, attempting to reach her son as the reality of my threat set in. But a passing nurse firmly stopped her, urging her back against the wall. Marcus stepped smoothly between me and Julian, his massive frame creating an impenetrable physical barrier. He looked down at my ex-husband with absolute, undisguised disgust.
If you ever attempt to put your hands on my sister again, I will personally ensure a federal assault charge is added to your indictment, Marcus promised, his deep baritone vibrating with lethal authority.
Marcus placed a protective hand gently on the small of my back, guiding me away from the chaos. We walked toward the elevator bay without looking back. I reached out and pressed the call button. The bright chime of the digital indicator echoed through the destroyed hallway one last time. As the heavy silver doors slid open, I stepped inside and turned to face the corridor. Julian was on his knees, openly sobbing, begging the guards to let him go so he could speak to me. Chloe was still huddled by the reception desk, a pathetic ball whose fake, glamorous life had been entirely erased. Eleanor was weeping hysterically, the elite aristocratic facade entirely incinerated by the humiliating spectacle of her son's ruin. I offered them not a single shred of mercy. I stood perfectly straight, my posture absolute iron. The silver elevator doors slid smoothly shut, sealing them in the hell of their own making, and taking me one step closer to the final financial execution. The drive back to my high-security penthouse in downtown San Francisco from the Palo Alto Clinic was completely silent. Marcus drove his heavy federal SUV with the same intense, quiet focus he applied to courtroom prosecutions. Marcus pulled the SUV into my private underground garage. We walked into the private elevator together. As the thick, frosted glass doors pushed open, we stepped into my domain. My home office was not a standard remote workspace. It was a digital war room. As a senior compliance and risk architect handling multi-million-dollar discrepancies, I required absolute technical superiority. My custom desk spanned the entire back wall, supporting an array of 6 high-resolution monitors connected to an encrypted proprietary server rack humming quietly in the corner. I did not rely on standard search engines. I utilized advanced data scraping software, secure public record databases, and predictive financial algorithms, designed specifically to track vanishing capital across the globe. I removed my charcoal blazer, draping it over the back of the ergonomic leather chair, and rolled up the sleeves of my white silk blouse. Marcus pulled up a side chair next to me as the 6 monitors flared to life, bathing the dark room in a sharp blue glow.
We have a verbal confession of perjury in a clinic hallway and a $12 million starting point, I stated, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. Eleanor screamed about him using a Bahamas account, but Julian is not smart enough to execute international wire transfers directly from his private equity fund without triggering an internal compliance audit. He had to launder the money domestically first before moving it offshore.
Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He is a managing director of mergers and acquisitions, Marcus noted, his deep eyes tracking the lines of code scrolling across my primary monitor. He has the executive clearance to authorize massive capital movements under the guise of alternative investments. Victor mentioned a phantom deficit created by alleged market volatility. Julian was bleeding his clients dry, but he still needed a clean local vehicle to wash the embezzled cash before routing it to the Bahamas. I need a domestic cleaning service, I murmured, my eyes darting between screens as I initiated a deep dive into California real estate and commercial registries. I need a localized asset class that handles high-volume cash transactions with minimal federal oversight. I typed in the first and last name of the woman whose life had just been utterly dismantled in the clinic lobby. The database processed for 3 seconds before Chloe's official commercial business license profile popped onto the screen. "Let us look at my former personal assistant," I said, clicking through the files. Chloe happened to secure her license for high-end interior design and procurement exactly 18 months ago, right around the time my marriage mysteriously began to fracture. Before that, she was an administrative assistant making $70,000 a year. Suddenly, she is driving European sports cars and procuring antiques and artwork for multi-million-dollar estates. I launched a second forensic program, linking Chloe's corporate registration number directly to the Santa Clara County commercial transaction records. I ordered the software to pull every commercial and residential interior design invoice, LLC filing, an escrow transfer receipt, where Chloe was listed as the primary buyer or procurement agent over the last 2 years. The results populated instantly, flooding 3 of my monitors with dozens of fraudulent artwork deeds and furniture import manifests. The sheer volume of transactions was staggering for a novice designer. But as a trained eye swept over the data, the underlying pattern became immediately obvious. "Look at the buyer and seller names on these specific invoices," I directed, pointing a pen at the central screen. Chloe was not procuring items for real families or legitimate commercial developers. She was representing anonymous LLCs. Marcus leaned in close, reading the dense legal text. Apex Holdings, LLC. Aurora Northwest Assets, LLC. Emerald Horizon Design, LLC. Marcus read the names aloud, his tone shifting into the cold, clinical cadence of a federal prosecutor. "They are all registered to the exact same blind registered agent address in Delaware. It is a massive web of shell companies." I pulled up the escrow transfer logs, cross-referencing the dates of Chloe's phantom art sales with the timeline of Julian's divorce disclosures. The financial puzzle pieces fit together with lethal perfection, forming a stunning picture of criminal conspiracy. "This is how they did it," I explained, the adrenaline of the hunt sharpening my focus. Julian embezzled the funds from wealthy clients like Victor, disguising the theft as high-yield alternative venture investments. He wired the stolen corporate capital directly into escrow accounts controlled by Chloe's firm. I clicked on one of the transactions, highlighting the financial flow in bright red across the screens. Chloe then used her license to execute fake sales of antiques and furniture between the different shell companies. I continued, mapping out the laundering cycle. She artificially inflated the value of the assets, passing money back and forth between Apex Holdings and Emerald Horizon for a painting that did not exist, or a shipment of fictional Italian furniture. Every time the asset changed hands, the embezzled money was legally washed through the escrow accounts as clean, legitimate art capital gains. Marcus crossed his arms, the full scale of the federal crime settling heavily into the room. And once the money was officially laundered through the fraudulent California high-end interior design market, Chloe wired the clean cash directly to the Bahamas routing numbers Eleanor was bragging about in the clinic hallway. "Exactly," I confirmed, clicking the print command to send the digital paper trail to my secure laser printer. They were operating a highly sophisticated localized laundering syndicate. Julian supplied the stolen corporate capital from his clients, and Chloe supplied the legitimate procurement vehicle to wash it clean. It was a perfect parasitic ecosystem. They thought they were completely untouchable. Marcus let out a low whistle of genuine professional appreciation. "Do you realize what you just uncovered, Claire? This is no longer a simple family court asset dispute. By utilizing federally insured private equity funds to wire stolen capital across state lines into Delaware shell companies before moving it internationally, they just triggered the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This is a full-blown RICO case." I reached over to grab the thick stack of warm paper from the printer tray. The undeniable, irrefutable evidence of their destruction rested heavily in my hands.
"I know, Marcus," I answered, a cold, satisfied smile touching my lips. "I promised Julian I would bankrupt him, but the federal government is going to ensure he never sees the outside of a prison cell for the rest of his life.
Now we just wait for him to panic, because a cornered, desperate man is about to make the biggest digital mistake." of his entire criminal career.
I placed the stack of warm, printed documents onto the sleek glass surface of my custom desk. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms as we stared at the glowing monitors.
The financial trap was completely constructed. We had the routing numbers, the shell company records, and the federal medical subpoenas. Now, we simply had to wait for Julian to voluntarily execute his own final, fatal mistake. We did not have to wait long. Less than 2 hours after leaving the clinic corridor, my primary banking monitor flared to life. A bright red notification banner flashed rapidly across the top of the digital display, accompanied by a sharp, mechanical alert from the secure server rack in the corner. "Right on schedule," I announced, my eyes locking onto the flashing red text. "He is making his move," Marcus said, leaning forward, his hands resting on the edge of the glass desk. "What exactly are we looking at, Claire?" he asked, his voice dropping into a serious professional register. "During our marriage, Julian established a dual authorization protocol through his fund to oversee our joint accounts," I explained, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard as I tracked the incoming digital request. "When we finalized our divorce agreements, he swore under penalty of perjury that he had completely severed all digital access to my personal bank accounts. But Julian is a control freak. He secretly kept a shadow backdoor access token active on his corporate servers,
just in case he ever felt the need to assert financial dominance over me again.
As a risk architect, I discovered that dormant token 6 months ago. I did not delete it. I left it active specifically to serve as bait for a moment exactly like this." I pointed to the red banner, tracing the origin of the digital command. "He is currently attempting to trigger a localized asset freeze on my primary checking and savings accounts. He is trying to completely lock down my liquid capital. He wants to drain my resources so that I cannot afford a massive legal team to hunt down his offshore accounts." Marcus let out a low, dark chuckle. "He is trying to financially starve out a senior compliance architect," Marcus noted, shaking his head at the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. "He truly is the stupidest man alive." Before the digital freeze could even fully process, the sleek black smartphone sitting on my desk began to vibrate violently. The caller ID screen lit up, displaying Julian's private cell phone number. The cornered animal was finally striking back. I routed the incoming call directly through my encrypted desktop server. I reached out and pressed the prominent green digital record button on the audio software, ensuring that every single syllable would be captured, stored, and verified for federal prosecution. Then I hit the speakerphone button, letting Julian's frantic voice fill the quiet war room. "You think you are so brilliant, don't you, Claire?" Julian spat the moment the call connected. His voice was completely unhinged, vibrating with a mixture of pure panic and desperate, forced aggression. "You think you can just walk away in a clinic hallway and threaten to bankrupt me? You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with." I remained perfectly silent. In any interrogation or extortion attempt, silence is the absolute most effective weapon. It forces a panicked attacker to fill the void with their own incriminating words. "Did you really think I would not take precautions?" Julian demanded, his heavy, irregular breathing echoing through the desktop speakers. "I manage multi-million-dollar portfolios for a living. I know how to neutralize an adversary. Try logging into your bank accounts right now, Claire. Go ahead and try. You are completely locked out. I just froze your entire financial existence. Your checking, your savings, your contingency funds. They are completely inaccessible. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now, let alone hire a team of federal lawyers to fight my offshore trusts." I glanced at Marcus, who was wearing a cold, predatory smile. I leaned closer to the desktop microphone, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "You have no legal authorization to freeze my personal assets, Julian," I stated calmly, professionally prompting him to dig his grave even deeper. "We are divorced. This is a direct violation of federal banking statutes." "I do not care about banking statutes," Julian roared, his massive but fragile ego completely overriding his basic survival instincts. I have executive clearance at the firm. I can freeze whatever I want and bury the documentation so deep your little forensic software will never find it. You pushed me too far today, Claire. You humiliated me in front of my mother. You let Victor threaten me. Now you're going to pay the price. And what exactly is that price, Julian? I asked, my tone flat and analytical. You're going to sign a non-disclosure agreement, Julian commanded, his voice dripping with the vicious arrogance. I already have my corporate attorneys drafting the paperwork. It states that you completely waive any claim to the $12 million in the Bahamas accounts. It states that you will never speak to the federal authorities, the IRS, or the SEC about my business practices or Chloe's design and real estate transactions. You will sign it, and you will have it notarized by tomorrow morning. I tapped a manicured fingernail against the glass desktop, watching the audio waveforms, logging his voice. And if I refuse to sign this non-disclosure agreement? I asked smoothly. If you refuse, I will lock your accounts permanently, Julian threatened, delivering the exact fatal phrasing I required. I will drain your credit lines. I will use my firm to blacklist your compliance career across the entire West Coast. You will not be able to afford the rent on your penthouse. I will leave you broke and homeless on the streets of San Francisco. Either you sign the paperwork and stay quiet about the embezzlement, or I will destroy your entire life. Do we understand each other, Julian? The elements of federal extortion had been officially satisfied. A clear demand for legal concessions under the direct threat of financial ruin and professional destruction. We understand each other perfectly, Julian, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. I have everything I need. Before he could utter another pathetic threat, I reached out and decisively severed the connection. The war room fell into a heavy, absolute silence. I clicked the mouse, saving the encrypted audio file to 3 separate, secure cloud locations. Marcus stood up from his leather chair, adjusting his custom suit jacket. A verbal confession of perjury in a clinic hallway, followed by a recorded attempt at federal extortion over the phone, Marcus summarized, his deep eyes gleaming with absolute lethal professional satisfaction. You just handed me a flawless, airtight federal indictment on a silver platter, Claire. I am not even finished yet, I answered, turning my attention back to the primary banking monitor. The extortion was just the appetizer, Marcus. I want the entire corporate empire, and he's about to hand us the keys to his firm's mainframe. The flashing red banner, indicating the asset freeze, was still pulsing rapidly at the top of the digital display. The progress bar beneath the alert text was steadily advancing toward 100%. Marcus leaned over my shoulder, watching the unauthorized commands execute on my screen, a dark frown creasing his brow.
Well, why aren't you running the counter protocols? Marcus asked, a note of genuine professional confusion in his voice. You have the executive safety clearance to kill this request instantly. You could lock him out of your personal accounts with a single keystroke. Why are you letting him freeze your liquid capital?
I am letting him freeze my accounts because I want him to leave a permanent digital footprint, I explained, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard as I initiated a secondary background tracking sequence. If I block the request right now, he simply gets a standard error message and logs off. But if I allow the freeze command to process completely through the financial clearinghouse, his computer is forced to execute a complex digital handshake with the federally insured banking servers. I pointed to a window on the left monitor where raw green code was scrolling rapidly. Julian is sitting in his corner office at his private equity firm right now, I continued, my eyes tracking the incoming data packets. He isn't using a burner phone, and he isn't on a personal laptop at a coffee shop. He is too arrogant to believe anyone can catch him. He is executing this unauthorized asset freeze directly through his secure internal mainframe terminal. When that progress bar hits 100%, his firm's highly encrypted network will be forced to interface with my bank's federal servers to validate the command. Marcus crossed his arms, a look of deep realization washing over his face. You are using your own bank account as a digital honeypot, Marcus noted, his tone dropping to a low register of professional awe. You are baiting him into logging the exact corporate internet protocol address into a permanent federal ledger. Exactly, I confirmed. The progress bar on the central monitor suddenly flashed a solid, brilliant red. The text on the screen shifted from processing to locked. My primary checking and savings accounts were officially frozen. I had absolute zero access to my own money. Julian believed he had just won the war. He believed he had successfully stripped away my ability to fight back. Instead, he had just blinded his way into a digital trap, from which there was no escape. I immediately executed the tracking protocol that had been running in the background. The 6 monitors in my war room worked in perfect synchronization, rapidly processing the encrypted data packets that had just hit my bank's servers. I bypassed the standard security firewalls, isolating the exact point of origin for the malicious freeze command. A 12-digit string of numbers materialized in bold white text against the black background of my primary screen. There it is, I announced, a cold wave of victory rushing through my veins. That is the static corporate IP address assigned directly to Julian's executive terminal at the private equity firm. He just hard-coded his physical office location to a federal cybercrime. But capturing his IP address was only the first half of my strategy. Now, I needed to weaponize it entirely. I opened a new command terminal, importing the massive volume of data we had gathered earlier regarding Chloe's fraudulent interior design syndicate. I pulled up the registration documents for Apex Holdings, Aurora Northwest Assets, and the rest of the Delaware shell companies. Then I accessed the digital login logs for the Bahamas offshore routing accounts that Eleanor had so helpfully screamed out in the clinic hallway. I launched a rapid cross-reference algorithm, commanding my proprietary software to compare Julian's newly captured corporate IP address against the login history of the illegal shell companies. The secure server rack in the corner of my office hummed loudly, the processors working through the massive data load. If Julian was running a $12 million embezzlement scheme, he had to manage those stolen funds somehow. I explained to Marcus while the system worked. He had to log into the Delaware LLC portals to authorize the fake artwork procurements. He had to log into the Bahamas accounts to verify the international wire transfers. And because he is an arrogant control freak who spends 80 hours a week trying to impress his bosses, I guarantee you he was managing his entire criminal empire straight from his executive desk. Linda understands. The monitors chimed simultaneously. The algorithm had completed its sweep. The results cascaded down the screens in a cascading waterfall of undeniable, irrefutable evidence. Every single illegal transaction executed by Chloe through her license corresponded to a digital authorization ping, and every single authorization ping originated from the exact same static 12-digit IP address. Right from Julian's executive terminal, right from inside that building. Marcus placed his hands flat on the sleek glass surface of my desk, leaning in to stare at the data. His breathing was slow and deliberate, entirely captivated by the sheer volume of evidence I had just assembled. He didn't just use his firm's network to extort you, Marcus stated, his deep baritone echoing through the quiet room. He used the firm's secure mainframe to actively manage a federal money laundering syndicate. He routed $12 million in stolen client funds through the exact same servers his CEO uses to manage legitimate institutional wealth. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my arms. He has completely compromised a multi-billion-dollar financial institution, I replied, my tone clinical and absolute. He turned a legitimate private equity firm into a digital hub for international money laundering. When the Securities and Exchange Commission sees this server log, they won't just arrest Julian. They will raid the entire building. They will seize the firm's hard drives and audit every single executive portfolio. Julian believed he was a financial mastermind. He believed that hiding money in the Bahamas made him an untouchable ghost. He genuinely believed that freezing my checking account would leave me broken and defenseless. But my forensic trap had snapped completely shut. I had successfully tied his blatant attempt at extortion directly to his massive corporate embezzlement operation, leaving a digital trail of breadcrumbs so thick and highly encrypted that even the most elite team of defense attorneys would never be able to erase it. I looked up at my brother, The federal indictment was complete. The digital evidence was locked. The trap was secure. Now it was time to execute the absolute public destruction of the man who had tried to cast me aside. The 6 monitors cast a cool blue light, bathing the war room in a sharp digital glow. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the final data packets compile into a perfectly encrypted federal dossier. We had achieved total victory. But the technical reality of a financial institution managing billions in assets is that their internal security network is far from passive. They deploy massive automated compliance algorithms to monitor every single keystroke an executive makes. And Julian had just committed a catastrophic error. I pointed to the secondary monitor on the right. A new stream of data began to cascade down the screen, indicating a sudden aggressive bounce from a digital firewall. What? When my proprietary software tracked Julian's IP address, it didn't just passively record the 12-digit number, I explained, my eyes locked onto the screen. My system executed a reverse digital handshake, bouncing a verification signal directly back to the source to confirm the static corporate address. Marcus leaned closer, narrowing his eyes at the rapidly scrolling code. "What is happening now, Claire?" he asked, his voice tense with anticipation. "His firm has an internal cybersecurity protocol," I explained. When my server bounced the verification signal back to his computer, his executive dashboard undoubtedly flagged the external trace. The firm's IT department just received an automated alert indicating that a managing director bypassed standard compliance channels to execute a malicious freeze on a non-affiliated civilian bank account. Worse for him, he now knows that I successfully traced his exact location. Right on cue, my secure desktop system logged a frantic termination of his network connection. Julian had panicked and pulled the digital plug, but it was already far too late. The digital fingerprints were locked in my encrypted cloud vault. The silence in the war room was deafening. It stretched on for a full 2 minutes. Then, the black smartphone sitting on my glass desktop vibrated violently once again. The caller ID screen lit up, flashing his private cell phone number. Marcus let out a low, short laugh, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "The absolute audacity of this man," Marcus muttered. "He just realized he handed you the exact weapon that will destroy him, and now he is calling back to beg." I reached out and pressed the green record button on the audio software for the 2nd time today. I routed the call through the desktop speakers, ensuring the audio capture was flawless. Then, I accepted the call, maintaining a perfect, absolute silence. "Claire!" Julian panted, his voice completely unhinged. The vicious, arrogant tyrant who had threatened to leave me homeless on the streets of San Francisco just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. His tone was frantic, high-pitched, and out of breath. He sounded like a man who was actively suffocating. "Claire, are you there? Please, tell me you are listening." I let the heavy silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, forcing him to stew in his own pure terror. "Yes, Julian," I replied, my voice perfectly flat and clinical. "I'm here." "What did you just do?" Julian demanded, his words tumbling over each other in a chaotic rush. A massive red security alert just popped up on my terminal. My dashboard says an external trace successfully targeted my IP address. "You tracked me. You pinged my corporate network. Claire, you have to delete that log right now. You cannot keep that IP address on your servers." "Why is that, Julian?" I asked with faux innocence, leaning slightly toward the microphone. "Is there something illegal tied to that specific corporate network location?" A pathetic whimper escaped his throat. He knew I had connected all the dots. He knew I held the Bahamas routing numbers and the Delaware Shell Company ledgers. He understood that with his IP address, I possessed the final, irrefutable link, proving he operated the entire laundering syndicate directly from his wealth management desk. "Claire, please," Julian begged, his voice breaking into an outright sob. "You don't understand what this will do to me. If compliance audits that specific terminal, they will see everything. The SEC will get involved. I will be sent to a federal penitentiary. They will lock me away forever." "No, Julian," I stated, without a single ounce of mercy in my tone. "The mandatory minimum sentences for embezzlement and wire fraud are severe. You should have considered that before you stole $12 million from your clients to buy Chloe a house. I will give you money, Julian blurted out, abandoning any remaining shred of corporate dignity. His absolute desperation drove him to commit another major federal felony over an openly recorded line. I will pay you to erase the trace. I will give you $500,000 right now. Clean cash, wired directly to any secure account of your choosing. Just wipe the servers, Claire, please. I looked at Marcus, who raised an eyebrow in sheer professional shock. A federal IRS investigator was standing in my office, listening to a managing director actively attempt to bribe a witness.
Oh, 500,000, I repeated, my voice dripping with cold, analytical contempt. You think your freedom is only worth $500,000?
No, wait, Julian stammered, his panic escalating to a fever pitch. $1 million. I can liquidate a shadow fund right now. I can give you $1 million, Claire. $1 million in clean, untraceable cash. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you the Atherton house. I will leave Chloe. Just name your price. Please, do not hand that digital log over to the federal authorities. I am begging you on my knees, Claire. Show some mercy. He was openly crying now. The once untouchable financial genius was sobbing through the desktop speakers, offering me $1 million fortune just to pretend I saw nothing. For a decade, he had made me feel worthless, and now he was grovelling, offering a fortune just to save his own pathetic skin. I stared at the audio waveforms jumping on the monitor, capturing his federal bribery attempt perfectly. I had the perjury admission, I had the extortion threat, I had the IP address tying him to the embezzlement, and now I had a clearly documented $1 million bribe. The arsenal was completely loaded. I leaned in close to the microphone, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across my face. I will see you at the charity gala tomorrow night, Julian, I stated, my voice carrying the chilling weight of an impending execution. Claire, no, please, Julian screamed, his voice torn apart by raw horror. I reached out and cut the connection, severing his desperate wail. The war room returned to a peaceful, quiet stillness. I saved the audio file, encrypting it alongside the rest of the federal dossier. The trap had closed completely. Tomorrow evening, Julian's firm was hosting their annual Elite Society Charity Gala at the Fairmont, San Francisco. He would be surrounded by his wealthy clients, his corporate peers, and his oblivious CEO. And I was going to walk straight through those double doors and incinerate his entire world. The following evening, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont, San Francisco had been transformed into an absolute fortress of high society luxury. Julian's private equity fund spared no expense for their annual charity gala. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the imported marble floors. Servers in crisp white tuxedos glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate caviar hors d'oeuvres. It was the premier event on the corporate calendar, designed specifically to showcase the success of the firm's elite tier and stroke the massive vanities of their wealthiest clients. Julian and Chloe arrived in a rented black Lincoln limousine, attempting to project an illusion of absolute invincibility. Despite the apocalyptic destruction of their private lives just 24 hours prior, they were desperately performing a united front for the flashing cameras of local society photographers. Chloe wore a tight silver designer gown she had purchased before Victor permanently froze her black cards. She clung tightly to Julian's arm, flashing a brilliant practiced smile that completely failed to hide the terrified, hollow look in her eyes. Her gold digger persona was fracturing under the immense weight of her impending poverty. Julian looked far worse. He wore a custom black tuxedo, but the sharp tailoring could not hide the physical toll of his absolute panic. He was sweating heavily. His eyes darted frantically across the ballroom, scanning the shadows. He spent the entire evening looking over his shoulder, waiting for federal agents to kick down his front doors. When the entire morning had passed without an arrest, he had foolishly deceived himself into believing I was bluffing. He told himself that I was just a bitter ex-wife who lacked the true courage to take down a multi-billion-dollar financial institution. He thought if he could just survive the gala and shake hands with the CEO, he might somehow salvage his crumbling empire. He was wrong. At exactly 8 o'clock, The heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom pushed open. The low hum of wealthy corporate chatter suddenly diminished, shifting into a suppressed, shocked silence as people began to turn toward the foyer. I stepped into the ballroom, projecting the kind of lethal, untouchable confidence that cannot be bought or manufactured. I wore a breathtaking, razor-sharp sapphire silk evening gown that cascaded flawlessly onto the marble floor. The deep jewel tone provided a flawless contrast to the cold, clinical precision of my posture. I wore no excessive diamonds, making no attempt to compete with the tacky displays of wealth surrounding me. I carried only a simple black clutch, inside of which my encrypted digital tablet was perfectly concealed. I walked with a slow, deliberate grace through the parting crowd, looking every bit like an apex predator entering a pen full of trapped prey. Julian spotted me from across the room near the ice sculpture display. The champagne flute in his hand tilted violently, spilling the expensive liquid over the cuff of his tuxedo. Every remaining drop of colour drained from his face entirely, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Chloe let out a sharp, audible gasp, shrinking behind his shoulder, as if my sapphire dress were emitting physical radiation. Pure, arrogant panic took over Julian's mind. He could not allow me to ruin his image in front of his peers. He abandoned Chloe and marched aggressively across the ballroom floor, heading straight for me. 2 burly private security guards wearing black earpieces instinctively stepped to his sides, assuming I was an unauthorized threat.
"What on earth do you think you are doing here, Claire?" Julian hissed, his frantic, vicious whisper carefully modulated to keep from carrying across the quiet room. "Have you lost your mind? This is a private corporate event. You're not on the guest list. You do not belong in this building."
I stopped in my tracks. I looked him up and down, taking in the pathetic sweat beads forming on his forehead. "I belong anywhere I choose to show up, Julian," I replied, my voice perfectly smooth and just loud enough to carry to the surrounding executives. Julian's face flushed a deep purple, his fragile ego shattering completely under the weight of his fear. He turned to the 2 imposing security guards, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "Remove this woman immediately," Julian commanded, his voice rising into an embarrassing, desperate shout. "She is my ex-wife. She is completely unhinged, and she crashed this gala just to cause a scene. Grab her right now and throw her out the back doors." The 2 guards took a step forward, reaching out their massive hands to secure my arms. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I kept my eyes locked onto Julian, waiting for the exact moment his assumed authority vaporized. Before the guards could even touch the silk fabric of my gown, a booming, authoritative voice echoed sharply across the silent ballroom. "Stand down immediately. Do not touch her." The crowd parted seamlessly like the Red Sea, allowing the CEO of the private equity firm to step to the front. Mr. Richard was a distinguished silver-haired man who commanded absolute respect in the financial world. He was known for his cold efficiency and a reputation for zero tolerance regarding corporate liability. He walked straight toward the guards, waving them off with a sharp flick of his wrist. The guards immediately stepped back, lowering their hands and returning to their posts. Julian stared at his boss, his jaw dropping completely open.
"Mr. Richard," Julian stammered, attempting to quickly smooth the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for this interruption. This is my ex-wife, Claire. She is highly unstable, and she crashed the gala to cause trouble. I was just having security escort her out of the venue to protect the firm's reputation."
Mr. Richard did not look at Julian. He turned his attention directly to me, offering a brief, respectful nod that completely validated my presence in the room. "She didn't crash the gala, Julian," Mr. Richard stated, his voice echoing with cold corporate finality. "And she is absolutely not trespassing. Claire is attending tonight as my personal VIP guest." Julian blinked, his brain completely unable to process the reality unfolding in front of him. "Mr. Richard, your guest?" Julian repeated, his voice sounding small and fragile. "But why? She doesn't work for our firm." "Everything changed at 6 a.m. today," Mr. Richard replied, turning a sharp, chilling gaze toward Julian. "Yesterday afternoon, our internal cybersecurity network flagged a massive, unauthorized breach originating directly from your executive terminal. Compliance notified me that you bypassed our security firewalls to execute a malicious financial command on a civilian bank account. It is a catastrophic violation of our federal charter. Julian's knees visibly buckled. The room full of wealthy clients and corporate peers stood paralyzed, a collective intake of breath rippling through the ballroom. I cannot allow a breach of this magnitude to be handled internally, Mr. Richard continued, his tone devoid of any mercy. I need an independent forensic audit to determine exactly how far you have compromised our network. So, I have hired the absolute best expert in the field. Claire is not just your ex-wife, Julian. She is my newly appointed Chief Independent Compliance Auditor for this entire financial institution.
And she has my full executive authority to tear your entire department apart.
Julian stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, completely isolated under the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. He had tried to lock me out of my own life. Instead, he had just handed me the keys to his entire corporate kingdom. I offered a cold, perfectly tailored smile, my grip tightening on my black leather clutch. The social execution had been flawless, but the real financial slaughter was only beginning. Mr. Richard turned away from the trembling M&A director and gestured toward the VIP elevator bank, signaling that we would begin the formal corporate review immediately. I gave the CEO a polite, knowing nod, confirming his instructions. Before heading up to the glass-walled conference room, I needed a quiet moment to sync my encrypted tablet to the internal mainframe and organize the federal files. I excused myself and, avoiding the shell-shocked crowd, made my way across the polished marble floor toward the luxurious powder room near the main foyer. The powder room was a sprawling sanctuary of rose-gold mirrors, velvet lounges, and soft ambient lighting, designed specifically for the elite wives of the company's highest earners. Several executive spouses stood at the long vanity, adjusting their diamond necklaces and reapplying expensive lipstick. They were whispering frantically about the dramatic public confrontation that had just unfolded. As I pushed through the heavy wood door, the chatter stopped instantly. They parted respectfully, stepping away from the sinks to give me a clear path. They recognized the unprecedented authority Mr. Richard had just bestowed upon me, and no one wanted to accidentally offend the woman who now held the keys to their husbands' careers. I placed my clutch on the pristine marble countertop and retrieved my encrypted tablet. Just as the screen lit up, the heavy doors of the powder room were shoved open with excessive force. Chloe stumbled in. The silver designer gown that had looked so glamorous an hour ago was now clearly disheveled, a delicate strap having slipped down. Her face was flushed a deep, blotchy red, and she gripped a half-empty glass of vintage champagne. She had clearly been drinking heavily, trying to numb the crushing reality of her collapsing financial stability.
Seeing me standing there, perfectly composed and preparing for my audit, triggered the final venomous remnants of her pride. She felt an urgent need to prove to the wealthy wives in the room that she was still the alpha.
Chloe slammed her champagne glass down onto the marble, the fine crystal producing a sharp, piercing ring against the stone. The other women in the room froze, turning to watch the unfolding disaster. Chloe strode toward me, her breath a mixture of expensive alcohol and pure desperation.
"You think you're so smart, don't you, Claire?" Chloe hissed, her voice vibrating with malice as she pointed a shaky finger at my chest. "You think putting on a nice dress and manipulating Mr. Richard makes you powerful. These women know exactly who you are and what you're trying to do."
Chloe turned to face the line of executive wives, gesturing wildly at me, attempting to rally the wealthy socialites to her defense. "She's nothing but a jealous, bitter ex-wife," Chloe announced, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "She's a total failure. She couldn't keep her own husband satisfied, so he left her for me. He bought me a $15 million estate in Atherton. We have a beautiful, perfect son, and now she is so consumed by sick, pathetic jealousy that she's trying to ruin his career with a fake audit. You all need to watch your husbands, because this woman is a completely unhinged stalker trying to tear our family apart." The executive wives exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances, shifting uncomfortably in their designer heels. They didn't support Chloe. They didn't offer her sympathy. They simply watched me, waiting to see how the company's new chief independent compliance auditor would handle this drunken, aggressive outburst. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't engage in a petty shouting match or fire back with shallow insults. I calmly locked my tablet screen and turned to face the woman who had once been my closest friend. "Drinking vintage champagne on an empty stomach, Chloe," I observed, my tone perfectly flat and clinical, cutting through her manic energy like a scalpel. "That is a very poor coping mechanism for someone about to lose everything." Chloe scoffed, rolling her eyes with exaggerated arrogance. "I'm not losing anything," she spat, crossing her arms defensively. "Julian is an M&A director. He brings millions into this firm. Tomorrow morning, he's going to shatter your pathetic little audit, and Mr. Richard will throw you back out onto the street."
I tilted my head, looking at her with a mix of clinical curiosity and absolute disdain.
"Julian isn't going to shatter a federal indictment," I corrected, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet powder room to ensure every woman heard the specific terminology. "Frankly, Julian's upcoming prison sentence is the absolute least of your worries. Let's talk about your immediate future. How exactly did your conversation with Victor at the clinic yesterday morning end? Did you manage to convince that billionaire to unfreeze the offshore crypto wallets he used to pay you?" The colour drained from Chloe's face instantly. The arrogant, drunken sneer melted away, replaced entirely by pure, unadulterated terror. The wealthy wives in the room let out a collective, sharp intake of breath. The sudden mention of Victor's name instantly pieced together in their elite social grapevine. They knew exactly who the AI founder was, and the implication that Chloe had received secret payments from him was devastating. "At 9 a.m. and today, Victor filed his emergency motion for custody," I continued, closing the distance to her trembling frame. "The family court judge reviewed the federally verified DNA results and granted the motion immediately. Victor's legal team is currently processing the paperwork to take your son and permanently strip you of all parental rights. Your biological payday is officially void, Chloe." Chloe shook her head violently, tears suddenly flooding her heavily mascara-laden eyes. "Stop," she whimpered, backing away until her hips hit the vanity. "You're lying. You're just lying to scare me." But I wasn't finished. The medical truth was just an appetizer. The financial penalty was the main course. "While Victor is legally taking your child, I am legally taking your freedom," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that left her paralyzed. "Did you really think you could use your high-end interior design license to launder $12 million of stolen corporate capital through Delaware shell companies without leaving a massive digital footprint?" The powder room fell into a dead silence. The executive wives stared at Chloe in horror, instinctively distancing themselves as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. Embezzlement was a serious offense, but bringing a money laundering syndicate into their social circle was an unforgivable sin. "Money laundering," I announced, ensuring the federal accusation hung heavy in the air. "Authorities are currently drafting search warrants to permanently revoke your business license and seize the Atherton estate. You facilitated a massive domestic criminal syndicate. You're not some wealthy socialite, Chloe. You're an unemployed fraud facing a decade in federal prison." The sheer scale of the reality finally broke her. The alcohol-fueled bravado evaporated entirely, leaving only a terrified shell. Chloe let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. She didn't try to defend herself. She didn't try to spin another lie or throw another insult. The illusion had been burned away completely. She turned and practically ran toward the heavy wood door, pushing it open to escape into the crowded hallway, abandoning her half-empty champagne glass on the marble. I smoothed the silk of my sapphire gown, picked up my tablet, and walked past the stunned executive wives. The powder room warm-up was officially over. It was time to go upstairs to the glass conference room and finish the corporate slaughter. The VIP glass conference room hung directly over the grand ballroom, providing a wide, unobstructed view of the gala below. The thick, soundproof glass completely sealed out the music and noise, creating an atmosphere of suffocating silence. The rectangular conference table was carved from a single slab of polished black walnut, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. I entered the room with absolute, unshakable authority. took my seat at the end of the table, and opened my tablet, connecting it directly to the massive display monitor mounted on the far wall. Mr. Richard, the CEO, entered the room moments later. He carried a sleek silver briefcase, his expression carved from granite. He wasn't here to negotiate or hear excuses. He was here to cut a toxic liability out of his multi-billion-dollar firm. He took his seat at the head of the table, hands folded neatly before him, waiting for the execution to begin. 2 burly private security guards escorted Julian into the conference room. They didn't guide him gently. They practically shoved him through the double glass doors, forcing him into the chair directly opposite me. The guards stepped back, taking up positions near the exit to ensure Julian had absolutely no possibility of escape. Julian looked utterly destroyed. The custom tuxedo he had worn so proudly less than an hour ago was now a wrinkled mess. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between his angry boss and his cold, calculating ex-wife. He knew he was cornered, but his massive, arrogant ego refused to concede without a fight. He still believed he could talk his way out of this federal trap. "Mr. Richard," Julian began, his voice a frantic, breathless rush, leaning forward with his trembling hands on the polished walnut table. "Sir, I can explain everything. I swear to you this is a massive misunderstanding. Claire is trying to frame me because she's bitter about our divorce. The system flagged my terminal because I was running a routine, unauthorized compliance check on a suspicious civilian account to protect the firm. There is no breach. There are no stolen funds. I am a dedicated M&A director. I have brought millions to this firm. You can't just take the word of a disgruntled ex-wife over your top earner." Mr. Richard didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice or show a shred of sympathy. He simply moved his cold gaze from Julian and looked directly at me. "Conduct the audit, Claire," Mr. Richard commanded, his voice echoing with absolute chilling authority. I tapped the screen of my tablet, and the massive display on the wall instantly lit up. A high-resolution map of encrypted data filled the screen, highlighting a complex network of corporate accounts, offshore routing numbers, and localized Delaware shell companies. Julian froze instantly, his frantic plea dying in his throat. He stared at the incredibly precise digital blueprint of his entire criminal empire.
"This isn't a simple internal compliance error, Mr. Richard," I began, my voice perfectly flat and analytical, designed specifically to cut through Julian's frantic lies. "What you are looking at is a highly sophisticated, systematic embezzlement network. For the past 18 months, it has been executed directly from Julian's executive terminal."
I swiped across the tablet, zooming in on the upper left quadrant of the digital map. Julian used his executive management privileges to isolate high-yield alternative investment portfolios belonging to the firm's top-tier clients. I explained, pointing a laser pointer at specific corporate ledgers. He specifically targeted clients moving large amounts of unregulated capital, which made it easier to disguise phantom deficits as standard market volatility. He locked onto Victor's AI investment fund and, under the guise of algorithmic errors, siphoned off millions. Over the course of a year, Julian systematically extracted $12 million of legitimate corporate capital directly from the firm's holding ledgers. Julian jumped out of his leather chair, his face turning a deep dark purple.
"That is a lie," he screamed, pointing a shaky finger at the screen. "You forged those ledgers. You hacked my terminal and planted those numbers to destroy me." "Sit down, Julian," Mr. Richard growled, the sheer force of his command echoing against the soundproof glass.
Julian slowly slumped back into his chair, swallowing hard as his last desperate hope for a defense evaporated. I tapped the tablet again, switching the display to show massive volumes of Delaware LLC registration documents and localized real estate and procurement escrow receipts. To bypass the firm's automated federal compliance checks, Julian needed a domestic vehicle to clean the stolen capital before routing it overseas. I continued, mapping out the laundering cycle with the lethal precision. He utilized his current wife, Chloe, who specifically obtained a high-end interior design procurement license for this purpose. Julian wired $12 million of stolen corporate capital directly into escrow accounts controlled by Chloe's firm.
She then executed a series of fraudulent sales of fake antiques and art pieces between anonymous Delaware shell companies, Apex Holdings, Aurora Northwest Assets, and Emerald Horizon Design.
I highlighted the IP address logs, linking the transactions together perfectly. Every time a shipment of fictional furniture changed hands, the embezzled money was legally laundered through the escrow accounts, appearing as clean, legitimate capital gains from art sales. I stated, ensuring Mr. Richard understood the gravity of the liability. And every single authorization ping required to manage this localized money laundering syndicate originated from the exact same static, 12-digit IP address. Directly from Julian's personal executive terminal, right here in this building. The silence in the conference room was absolute and terrifying. The CEO stared at the monitor, his greying hair catching the glare of the screen. He was watching his firm's flawless reputation being violently ripped apart. He understood that Julian hadn't just stolen money. He had actively weaponized the institution, turning a trusted private equity firm into a digital hub for a massive federal criminal syndicate. I swiped the tablet one last time, pulling up the final, irrefutable evidence. The audio waveform of the phone call Julian had made to me from his desk the previous day appeared on the screen. I hit play, and Julian's frantic, breathless voice filled the glass room. "I'll give you money." Julian's recorded voice echoed through the speakers. "I'll give you $500,000 right now. Clean cash, wired directly to any secure account of your choosing. Just wipe the servers clear. Please. $1 million. I can liquidate a shadow fund right now. I can give you $1 million clear. $1 million in clean, untraceable cash." The audio file clicked off, leaving the room in heavy, suffocating silence. He explicitly attempted to bribe a witness, offering a $1 million hush money payment to delete server logs and cover up his federal crimes. I concluded, closing my tablet and placing my hands flat on the table. "The audit is complete, Mr. Richard. The evidence is irrefutable. Your M&A director is a federal criminal." Julian dropped his head onto the polished walnut table, burying his face in his trembling arms. He let out a loud, pathetic whimper. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire universe had just collapsed. The custom tuxedo, the massive executive bonuses, the $15 million Atherton fantasy, it had all burned away. He was completely trapped, surrounded by the towering walls of justice he had arrogantly tried to manipulate, and I was the one who had just handed the blade to the executioner. Mr. Richard didn't offer a single word of comfort to the weeping man across the table. He simply stared at Julian with an expression of absolute disgust. A CEO of a multi-billion-dollar financial institution doesn't reach that position by being kind to thieves who weaponize his corporate network. He sat perfectly still, waiting for the pathetic display to end. Julian slowly lifted his head from his arms. His face was a miserable mask of sweat and raw fear. He looked at Mr. Richard, realizing that silence wasn't an invitation for an explanation. It was a death sentence. Pure, primitive survival instinct completely overwhelmed Julian's remaining shred of dignity. He shoved his chair back, the leather screeching against the polished marble floor, and slid out of his seat. Julian collapsed to his knees with a heavy thud. The sharp impact echoed in the soundproof room. He crawled forward on the floor, dragging his ruined custom tuxedo across the marble, until he was kneeling directly beside the CEO's chair. "Mr. Richard, please," Julian begged, his voice a high, frantic whimper. "I can fix this. I swear on my life, I can put every penny back. I'll empty the Bahamas accounts tonight. I'll wire the $12 million back into the firm's holding ledger immediately. I'll sell the Atherton estate tomorrow morning. I'll sell my cars. I'll liquidate my legitimate retirement portfolios to pay any institutional fines or compliance penalties. Just, please, don't turn this audit over to the authorities. If the government gets involved, my life is over. I'll do anything you want. I'll resign quietly. Just let me put the money back." Said and so. Mr. Richard looked down at the kneeling M&A director, as if Julian were a diseased rat that had just crawled out of a sewer grate. "You cannot just put the money back, Julian," Mr. Richard stated, his voice dropping to a terrifying bass. "You didn't make a clerical error. You committed premeditated federal wire fraud. You ran a money laundering syndicate through my corporate mainframe. You compromised the financial security of our top-tier clients and severely damaged this firm's pristine reputation. You're a cancer, Julian, and I am surgically removing you from my institution." Julian opened his mouth to launch another desperate, painful plea, but he never got the chance. The heavy glass doors of the VIP conference room were pushed open with an explosive, powerful impact. The sudden noise shattered the tension, causing Julian to instinctively recoil and cower beside the conference table legs. Marcus walked into the room. My brother looked like the absolute, undeniable embodiment of federal justice. He wore his signature sharp black suit, his silver FBI badge gleaming on his belt. But Marcus was not alone. Flanking him were 4 heavily armed federal agents in dark tactical windbreakers. 2 jackets were emblazoned with bright yellow FBI lettering. The others carried the insignia of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The cavalry had officially arrived. "Julian," Marcus announced, his deep, resonant baritone filling every corner of the glass conference room. He looked down at the cowering man on the floor with a gaze that was unfiltered and clinically judgmental. Julian let out a loud, gasping sob, scrambling backward on the marble floor like a trapped animal trying to escape a predator. He bumped into the base of the display monitor, pulling his knees to his chest and shaking his head violently. "No," Julian whimpered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "No, please, Claire, tell them to stop." I sat perfectly still at the end of the walnut table, smoothly closing the lid of my tablet. I didn't say a word. I had already made my judgment. Mr. Richards stood from his leather executive chair, towering over the pathetic M&S director like a monolith. "Julian, you are officially fired, effective immediately," Mr. Richard announced, his voice carrying the lethal weight of absolute corporate capital punishment. "Your access credentials are permanently revoked. Your corporate portfolios are frozen. I'm personally filing a civil lawsuit against you on behalf of the firm for institutional damages." Marcus gave a short, sharp nod to the federal agent standing beside him. "Execute the arrest warrant," Marcus ordered. 2 burly FBI agents stepped forward with tactical precision. They grabbed Julian by the shoulders, roughly hauling him up from the marble floor. Julian struggled weakly, his legs turning to jelly beneath him, but the agents supported him with effortless strength. They twisted his arms behind his back with ease. "Julian, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and racketeering," the lead FBI agent stated. He read the Miranda rights with cold, mechanical efficiency while reaching for a heavy pair of steel handcuffs on his tactical belt. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The crisp, metallic click, the sound of the handcuffs locking tight around Julian's wrists, echoed through the quiet room. It was the absolute final sound of his freedom being permanently extinguished. The golden boy, the untouchable financial genius, the arrogant husband who had mocked my biological struggles in a clinic hallway, was officially a federal prisoner in shackles. Marcus walked over to Julian, staring hard into his eyes. "You thought you could blackmail my family," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You thought you could hide behind your expensive suits and your offshore accounts. But you forgot one critical detail, Julian. You were never the smartest person in the room. Not by a long shot." "Take him out," Marcus ordered, stepping aside. The agents didn't lead Julian out through the discreet service elevator. That wasn't the protocol for a high-profile, white-collar crime raid. They marched him directly out of the glass conference room toward the grand, sweeping staircase that led straight into the heart of the charity gala. I stood from my chair, picked up my leather clutch and my tablet, and walked to the edge of the glass balcony, looking down into the massive ballroom. Mr. Richards stood beside me, hands clasped firmly behind his back. Together, we witnessed the absolute public annihilation of Julian's social standing. The moment the FBI agents escorted Julian to the top of the grand staircase, the house orchestra cut out. The joyous high society chatter vanished, and in its place was a collective, terrified intake of breath. Over 500 of Silicon Valley's wealthiest elites, corporate peers, and top clients turned in unison to witness the spectacle. Julian was marched slowly down the marble steps. The blinding crystal chandeliers illuminated his ruined tuxedo, his tear-streaked face, and the heavy steel handcuffs locked behind his back. The society photographers, hired to capture glamorous red carpet moments, swarmed to the bottom of the stairs. Their white camera flashes erupted like strobe lights, capturing every agonizing second of his humiliating perp walk. Julian tried to lower his head to escape the glare of the flashes, but the FBI agents pushed him forward with a relentless, brisk pace. He was marched directly through the center of the grand ballroom. Executives who had been shaking his hand an hour ago were physically backing away, looking at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. He was a corporate pariah, a verified thief being dragged in shackles out of his own prestigious event. I watched as the heavy mahogany double doors of the ballroom were pushed open, and the federal agents marched him out into the cold, damp San Francisco night. The flashing red and blue lights of the waiting federal transport vehicles cast a harsh, chaotic glare into the elegant foyer. And just like that, the untouchable M&A director was permanently erased from the elite world he had sacrificed everything to conquer. Exactly 3 months after the flashing lights of the federal transport van disappeared into the San Francisco night, I walked into the cavernous, mahogany-panelled courtroom of the federal family court. The legal fallout from the gala raid had been swift, absolute, and utterly devastating for those who had tried to destroy me. Because Julian had utilized federal banking networks for money laundering and committed perjury in a divorce settlement, the jurisdiction had been elevated. This was no longer a standard civil mediation. It was a consolidated hearing presided over by a federal judge who had zero tolerance for corporate crime, combining asset forfeiture and family court proceedings. I sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. My posture was straight, my hands resting calmly on the polished wood surface. Marcus sat directly beside me, acting as my lead investigative consultant, his massive frame radiating the lethal, quiet confidence of a federal lawman who had already won the war. On the other side of the aisle, the reality of the past 90 days was etched physically into the faces of the defendants. Julian was escorted into the courtroom by 2 armed marshals. The custom Italian tuxedo and silk tie were gone forever. He wore the bright, neon-orange jumpsuit provided by the federal detention facility. Heavy steel chains were wrapped around his waist, binding his wrists and ankles, and they clattered loudly with every dragging step he took. He looked emaciated, his skin pale, his hair dishevelled. The absolute horror of maximum security confinement had stripped away his arrogant VP facade, leaving behind an empty, broken shell of a man. Sitting at a separate defendant's table, completely isolated from Julian, was Chloe. Her descent into poverty had been remarkably fast. The SEC and the IRS had frozen her accounts instantly and seized the $15 million Atherton estate as the proceeds of money laundering. She was currently renting a room at a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. She wore a faded beige dress, her hair completely stripped of its expensive salon luster. She looked terrified, gnawing at her fingernails as she stared at the judge. Sitting at a third table was Victor. The AI billionaire wore a custom charcoal suit, flanked by 3 of the most expensive litigation attorneys on the West Coast. He looked utterly indifferent, like a predator waiting to collect a prize. Judge Reynolds, a stern federal judge with decades of experience on the bench, struck his gavel hard against the sound block. The massive sound instantly silenced the courtroom. "We have 2 separate dockets to resolve today," Judge Reynolds announced, his voice echoing with absolute judicial authority. "We will begin with the emergency petition for custody and paternity filed by the intervener regarding the 1-year-old male child." The judge picked up the sealed medical files and read the verified federal lab results into the public record. "And this court has reviewed the mandatory biometric screening and the subsequent independent DNA testing," Judge Reynolds said, looking over his glasses at Julian. "The medical evidence is conclusive. Julian suffers from complete, irreversible azoospermia. He has 0 biological connection to the child. The DNA results confirm with absolute certainty that Victor is the sole biological father." Julian closed his eyes, dropping his chin to his chest. The final nail had been driven into the coffin of his fabricated family.
But furthermore, Judge Reynolds continued, shifting his sharp gaze toward Chloe, this court has reviewed massive volumes of digital evidence provided by federal investigators regarding the mother's behavior. Chloe utilized the child as a pawn to extort the biological father for secret offshore cryptocurrency transfers. She is currently facing federal indictment for facilitating a domestic money laundering syndicate. She poses a severe financial and moral danger to the welfare of the infant.
Chloe let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying her face in her hands. I am granting immediate full physical and sole legal custody to the biological father, Judge Reynolds ruled, striking his gavel again. Chloe is permanently stripped of all parental rights. Visitation is denied pending the outcome of her federal criminal trial. The child is to be turned over to Victor's legal team by the close of business today. Victor didn't smile. He just gave a short nod of confirmation, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He had reclaimed his bloodline and utterly destroyed the woman who had tried to extort him. Now, Judge Reynolds shifted topics seamlessly, his expression darkening as he picked up the massive forensic financial dossier I had compiled. We moved to the matter of the nullified divorce settlement and the civil asset forfeiture. The judge looked directly at Julian, who was physically trembling in his orange jumpsuit. Julian, 1 year ago, you sat in family court and swore under penalty of perjury that your total marital assets were fully disclosed. Judge Reynolds' voice dropped to a low, lethal register. You actively deceived your ex-wife. You deceived your legal counsel, and you deceived the judicial system of the United States. You utilized your executive banking access to embezzle $12 million from your own clients, moving those stolen capital funds to shadow accounts in the Bahamas, while you cried poverty during your divorce mediation. Julian's public defender placed a warning hand on his client's arm, ensuring Julian's mouth stayed firmly shut. Because you committed egregious fraud upon the court to obtain the original divorce decree, that settlement is hereby vacated with extreme prejudice, Judge Reynolds declared. A standard 50-50 split of marital assets is off the table. This court recognizes the unparalleled forensic audit work performed by the plaintiff, Claire, to expose this massive criminal syndicate. The judge picked up his pen, staring hard into Julian's eyes. I award 100% of the $12 million recovered from the Bahamas accounts to Claire, Judge Reynolds ruled, his words hitting Julian's fragile sanity like physical blows. The federal government has successfully repatriated those funds, and they will be transferred directly into the plaintiff's private accounts by the end of this work week. Julian let out a strangled gasp. The massive financial loss squeezed every ounce of air from his lungs. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, due to the malicious nature of your extortion attempt and the severe emotional and financial distress caused to the plaintiff, I am ordering severe punitive damages, Judge Reynolds continued ruthlessly. Every remaining legitimate asset tied to your name is hereby seized. Your corporate 401k plan, your legitimate retirement portfolios, and the remaining equity from the seized Atherton estate are to be liquidated and awarded to Claire to cover her legal and investigative costs. Julian collapsed in his chair, the heavy steel chains clattering violently against the wood table. He was officially wiped out. The once untouchable M&A director now possessed a negative net worth. He had absolutely zero liquid capital to hire private defense counsel for his upcoming federal embezzlement trial, guaranteeing that he would be stuck with an overworked public defender who would be lucky to save him from 20 years in prison. You tried to financially starve your ex-wife and leave her homeless, Judge Reynolds concluded, striking his gavel with explosive force. Instead, you have bankrupted yourself. Civil hearing adjourned. Bailiffs return the prisoner to federal detention. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the absolute, undeniable victory. My forensic audit didn't just expose a lie. It fundamentally rewrote reality, delivering flawless, devastating justice. I picked up my leather briefcase, stood up, and prepared to walk out of the courtroom, watching the last pathetic ashes of their lives drift away in the wind. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom were pushed open, the intense drama of the hearing spilling out into the wide marble hallway. I walked out first, smoothing the cuffs of my custom navy suit, with Marcus walking in perfect stride beside me. The air outside felt incredibly fresh, completely devoid of the suffocating panic that had filled the room. But the absolute destruction I had meticulously planned wasn't quite over. Moments later, the doors opened again, and Victor walked out. The AI founder looked like a man who had just conquered a small country. He was surrounded by his elite legal team, completely ignoring the cameras flashing from the local media gathered at the end of the hall.
Safely tucked into his arms, wearing a small custom suit that likely cost more than my first car, was the 1-year-old boy. The child was quiet, completely unaware that the trajectory of his entire life had just been permanently altered.
Victor began walking toward the private elevator bank, his security detail shielding him closely on both sides. But he hadn't made it 5 paces when a desperate, hysterical scream echoed through the hallway. "Victor, wait, please!" Chloe sprinted out of the courtroom doors, nearly tripping over her faded beige dress. Her face was a horrific mask of smeared mascara, red blotches, and pure panic. She had just been legally erased from her biological child's life and permanently delicensed. Facing federal criminal charges and absolute poverty, she was desperate to cling to the only lifeline she believed she had left. She rushed through the hallway, diving directly into the path of Victor's security detail. Burly guards instantly raised their arms, forming an impenetrable physical barrier between the weeping woman and the billionaire. "You can't just take him," Chloe sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine as she reached for the baby. "He's my son. I gave birth to him. You have to let me see him, Victor. You can't just throw me away like trash. I loved you." Victor stopped. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with the absolute cold indifference one might reserve for an insect crushed on the side of the road. He adjusted his grip on the baby, ensuring the child was resting comfortably against his chest. "You loved the $15 million house," Victor corrected, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried clearly through the quiet hall. "You loved the offshore crypto transfers and the Centurion Black card. You used my son as a pawn to finance your pathetic, glamorous fantasy. Now the game is over, Chloe." "I have nothing left," Chloe screamed, tears streaming down her face as she collapsed onto the cold marble floor, falling to her knees. "The SEC took the house. They froze my accounts. I'm sleeping in a motel. Victor, please, just give me one more chance. I'll sign a prenup. I'll do anything you want. Just don't leave me with nothing." "You made your choices," Victor replied, his tone devoid of any mercy. "You chose to sleep with your husband behind your back. You chose to blackmail me. You chose to participate in a federal money laundering syndicate. Enjoy the consequences." Victor gave his security detail a short nod. The guards moved forward smoothly, physically pushing Chloe back against the wall to clear a path. Victor walked past her, the crisp click of his expensive Italian shoes echoing through the hall. He stepped into the private elevator, the silver doors sliding shut, permanently erasing him and the baby from Chloe's reality. Chloe slumped against the marble wall, burying her face in her hands, letting out a massive, guttural wail of total despair. She had played the ultimate high-stakes manipulation game, believing her beauty and cunning made her untouchable. Now she was utterly broke, childless, and completely alone. But her humiliation wasn't over. The heavy courtroom doors were pushed open one final time. 2 heavily armed federal marshals escorted Julian into the hall. The bright neon-orange jumpsuit completely swallowed his frame. The vibrant color stood in stark contrast to the elegant marble surroundings. The heavy steel chains around his waist and ankles clattered loudly, declaring his absolute submission to the federal justice system. Julian looked deathly ill. The judge's ruling, which had completely wiped out his entire net worth, had left him in a catatonic state of shock. He shuffled down the hall, his head down, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. Chloe heard the clanking of the chains and looked up. Seeing her ruined ex-husband seemed to ignite one final spark of malice within her. The desperation instantly transformed into pure, unadulterated hatred. She scrambled up on her hands and knees, fists clenched, and lunged toward him. "You ruined ruined my life, Chloe screamed, her voice tearing from raw, vicious fury. She pointed a trembling finger straight into his face, completely ignoring the marshals who stepped forward to intercept her. You promised me everything. You promised me an estate and a perfect life, and you couldn't even give me a real child. You dragged me into your pathetic little embezzlement scheme, and now the feds have taken everything I have. Julian stopped, looking up at her. The man who had been obsessed with projecting an image of absolute alpha dominance now looked like a broken, pathetic shell. He had destroyed his entire marriage for her, and the venomous insults coming from her now didn't seem to register in his mind at all. He just stared at her with hollow, dead eyes. You're just a defective, sterile thief, Chloe continued to scream, spit flying from her lips. You used me. You ruined me. I hope you rot in federal prison for the rest of your miserable life. Julian didn't scream back. He didn't try to defend his shattered ego. He just let out a faint, pathetic wheeze. A sound of absolute, total defeat. The marshals grabbed his arms, pulling him away from the hysterical woman, and escorted him down the hall toward the freight elevator that would transport him back to his maximum security cell. I stood near the main exit with Marcus, watching as the two people who had gleefully plotted my destruction played out their final spectacular collapse. They had drowned in the exact same toxic flood they had spent years pumping into my life. The golden boy and the beautiful gold digger were left tearing each other apart like mad dogs in a public hallway, stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their dignity. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. Anger requires an emotional investment, and I had completely bankrupted any feelings for these two pathetic strangers. The cancer in my life had been surgically removed, and I was finally, truly free. I adjusted the strap of my leather briefcase, turning my back on the screaming woman in the hallway. I pushed through the heavy glass exit doors of the courthouse, stepping out into the bright, crisp afternoon sun of San Francisco, leaving the ashes of their ruined lives in the dark corridors where they belonged. Later that week, the final federal wire transfer cleared. The $12 million legally awarded to me by the federal judge was deposited securely into my private offshore and domestic portfolios. I liquidated my past life completely and upgraded to a high-security luxury penthouse that spanned the entire top floor of a premier glass tower in downtown San Francisco. The building was a fortress. It featured a private underground garage, biometric elevator access, and a 24-hour armed concierge team. It was designed specifically to keep the noise and toxicity of the outside world completely at bay. It was a rainy Thursday morning when the intercom on my kitchen island buzzed. James, the head concierge, spoke in a tense, apologetic tone. Miss Claire, I'm terribly sorry to disturb you. There is a woman in the lobby who insists on seeing you. She bypassed the outer courtyard gate behind a delivery truck. She claims to be your mother-in-law, and she is becoming quite disruptive. I took a slow sip of black coffee, gazing out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the San Francisco skyline. Keep her at the front desk, James, I replied, my voice perfectly level. I'll be down shortly. I didn't rush. I took my time putting on a sharp, tailored beige trench coat over my dark slacks. When the private elevator doors opened in the spacious marble lobby, the scene playing out near the front desk stood in stark, pathetic contrast to the opulent surroundings. Eleanor stood near the velvet lounge area, arguing frantically with two burly security guards. The arrogant, untouchable, elite matriarch who had strutted through the clinic hallway in a brand new Chanel suit was gone completely. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She wore a wrinkled, faded sweater, and her expensive bleached blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, unkempt knot. She clutched a worn leather bag to her chest, like a physical shield. The absolute destruction brought by Julian's federal indictment and the civil asset forfeiture had shattered her aristocratic illusions. The Julian family had officially gone bankrupt. She saw me step out of the elevator and immediately broke away from the guards, rushing across the polished marble floor. Claire, Eleanor gasped, her voice cracking from pure, unadulterated panic. The guards ran forward to intercept her, but I raised a hand, signaling them to stop. They stepped back, allowing her to approach, but staying close enough to intervene immediately if she crossed a physical boundary.
You have 2 minutes, Eleanor, I stated, my voice perfectly calm, devoid of any welcoming warmth. Then you leave this building forever.
Eleanor didn't sneer. She didn't throw insults about my biology or my career. The sheer weight of her son's impending doom had shattered every shred of pride she possessed. Her knees visibly buckled, and right there in the pristine, brightly lit lobby of my luxury building, the once untouchable elite matriarch completely fell apart. She dropped to her knees on the cold stone floor. Real, desperate tears spilled over her lashes and streamed down her pale, makeup-free cheeks. "Please, Claire," Eleanor sobbed, reaching out to grab the hem of my trench coat. "I'm begging you. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. I called everyone. Every one of Julian's friends, his colleagues, his partners at the country club. They all blocked my number. The bank foreclosed on the Atherton house yesterday. Federal authorities froze my personal checking accounts because I was listed as a contingent beneficiary on his trusts. I have nothing left." I looked down at her, my resting heart rate remaining perfectly level. I didn't pull the coat away. I just watched her drown in the consequences of her own creation. "Sounds like a severe financial crisis," I answered, my tone clinical and detached. "But that is not my problem." "You have $12 million, Eleanor cried, her voice echoing loudly through the high-ceilinged lobby and drawing the attention of the concierge staff. "The judge gave you everything my son worked his entire life to build. You took every last cent. Julian's public defender is useless. He told Julian to take a plea deal and serve 15 years in a maximum security prison." 15 years, Claire. He won't survive it. He's an executive. He wasn't made for federal prison." Eleanor clasped her hands tightly before her, looking up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. "I just need a loan, just $500,000, to hire a top-tier federal defense attorney. You have so much. You could spare a small fraction to save his life. I'll pay you back. I'll get a job. I'll do whatever it takes. Please, have some mercy on us." She took a ragged, trembling breath and played her final, most pathetic card. "Oh, we're family, Claire. For 10 years I loved you like my own daughter. You can't just abandon your family." The sheer audacity of her plea hung heavy in the air. I stared at the woman kneeling at my feet. For 10 years, she had subjected me to a relentless campaign of passive-aggressive attacks and cruelty. She had picked apart my body, criticized my career, and enabled her son's toxic narcissism at every turn.
"Our family," I repeated, tasting the word like ash. I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile. "Where was this deep family loyalty last week, Eleanor? When you were standing in a crowded clinic hallway, screaming at the top of your lungs that I was a barren, defective failure?"
Eleanor flinched as if I'd slapped her, the sob catching in her throat. "You didn't treat me like a daughter," I said, my voice dropping to that cold, steady register that cut through her frantic sobbing. "You treated me like a failing corporate asset. You laughed to my face while you flaunted the millions your son had funneled through our accounts. You cheered when Victor threatened to take the child, completely oblivious to the fact that you were watching your own family legacy burn to the ground. You made your choices, Eleanor. You chose the thief and the grifter." "I was wrong," Eleanor wailed, her head dropping until her forehead touched the cold marble floor. "I was a foolish, arrogant woman. I'm so sorry. I'm truly, deeply sorry. Please, Claire, he is my only son. If he spends 15 years in a facility, I will die in isolation. Please, I beg you." I looked down at her trembling, pathetic form. I felt nothing. I had finished the audit on the Julian family a long time ago. The books were closed, and the debt had been paid in full. I stepped back, pulling the fabric of my coat from her desperate grip. I stared into her eyes, mirroring the exact toxic arrogance Julian had used on me the day he thought he had won. "Leaving your son to face the consequences of his own actions was the best decision I ever made," I stated, returning Julian's own cruel words to the air. Eleanor gasped, her eyes widening in absolute, terrifying realization. She knew exactly whose words those were. She knew there was no mercy left to be found here. The door was locked permanently. I turned my attention to the 2 security guards standing a few feet away. "Security, please escort this woman out of the building. If she attempts to step foot on this property again, contact the authorities immediately and file a formal trespassing charge. The guard stepped forward, grabbing Eleanor's arms and pulling her up from the marble floor. She didn't fight them. The last of her strength had been drained away. She hung limply between the two men, sobbing uncontrollably as they dragged her toward the heavy glass revolving doors. I didn't watch her leave. I turned around and walked back toward the private elevator. I pressed the call button and listened to the soft, melodic chime as the doors slid open. I stepped inside and ascended back to my high-security sanctuary, leaving the broken, weeping remnants of my past on the lobby floor, exactly where they belonged. Exactly 365 days after I left Eleanor crying on that marble floor, I stood on the polished teak deck of a private chartered yacht. The boat moved smoothly through the deep blue waters of the San Francisco Bay, leaving a brilliant white wake behind us. The afternoon sun poured down, warming my shoulders, while a crisp, salty ocean breeze brushed through my hair. Alcatraz and the Golden Gate Bridge stood in the distance, a magnificent, expansive testament to the empire I had successfully built. I took a deep breath, letting my lungs fill with the intoxicating scent of absolute freedom. In my right hand, I held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, watching the golden bubbles race to the surface. Standing to my left was my father. He had fully recovered from his heart surgery, wearing a relaxed linen shirt and a bright, vibrant smile that radiated pure joy. To my right stood Marcus. He had shed his formidable federal suit for a casual linen button-down. He looked relaxed, leaning against the yacht's polished mahogany railing. We weren't just celebrating the 1-year anniversary of my final victory. We were celebrating the dawn of an entirely new era. I raised my glass, and our 3 flutes clinked together. The crisp, clear sound was the perfect accompaniment to the rhythmic lapping of the waves. I didn't take the $12 million the court awarded me and quietly retire to some tropical island. Hiding was never in my nature. Instead, I took that infusion of capital and used my extensive network to build an absolute fortress. I founded my own elite private compliance and risk investigation firm in the heart of San Francisco's financial district. I leased a sprawling penthouse office space equipped with state-of-the-art encrypted servers and hired a dedicated team of sharp forensic accountants, digital tracing experts, and former federal compliance officers. My firm specializes in high-net-worth asset recovery. We handle complex cases representing women whose manipulative husbands are actively attempting to hide marital assets through intricate corporate structures, offshore trusts, and shadow shell companies. I use the same aggressive digital hunting techniques I used to confront Julian to systematically dismantle financial abusers. We tear open their fraudulent ledgers, expose their hidden digital wallets, and ensure that no woman has to walk away from a marriage empty-handed just because her husband thought he was smarter than the law. We are currently the most feared and sought-after financial investigation agency on the West Coast. My schedule for the next 2 years is already completely full, and those who tried to destroy me, their outcomes were far less favorable. For those who weaponized corporate networks to operate domestic money laundering groups, the federal justice system offers no early release or lenient plea deals. After the raid at the charity gala, Julian was denied bail. He sat in a county detention centre for 6 months awaiting trial. Without capital to hire a private defence team, he was forced to rely on an overworked public defender. The digital evidence I provided was undeniable. The federal jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts in less than 4 hours. Julian is currently serving his 15-year mandatory minimum sentence in a high-security federal correctional facility. The arrogant director who used to scream at his assistants over an unpressed tie now wears a standardized, uncomfortable orange uniform. He is locked for 23 hours a day in a dim 8 by 10 foot concrete cell. His multi-million-dollar investment portfolio is gone. His prestigious club memberships were revoked. The day the handcuffs clicked onto his wrists, his wealthy peers erased his name from their contacts forever. He's a ghost. He is completely irrelevant. Chloe is experiencing a different but equally devastating reality. After the biological father successfully filed for emergency custody and permanently stripped her of all parental rights, federal authorities moved in. The government revoked her interior design license and seized every designer asset she owned. She barely avoided federal prison time by testifying against Julian, but her felony conviction for financial conspiracy makes traditional corporate employment impossible. Today, the woman who once flaunted a $15 million estate and massive diamonds works a grueling minimum wage retail job at a discount department store. She stands all day folding cheap synthetic clothing, enduring the complaints of rude and impatient customers. She lives in a tiny, cramped studio apartment, constantly struggling to pay her utilities. Her artificial beauty has faded under the weight of extreme poverty and constant exhaustion. She has no wealth, no status, and no children. She's completely alone, drowning in the reality she built with her own hands. I turned my attention away from the distant city skyline to look at my father and brother. I took a slow, satisfying sip of champagne, letting the crisp, expensive taste linger on my palate. A year ago, I stood in a crowded clinic hallway, listening to a man tell me that because of my biological limitations, my entire existence was worthless. He tried to diminish my value. He tried to use his corporate power to intimidate me and leave me penniless. But he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of true power. Power does not come from bloodlines or corporate titles. Power comes from absolute, unshakable professional competence. It comes from keeping your heart rate steady and your mind sharp, while those around you succumb to their own toxic emotional chaos. I survived their ambush. I exposed their lies. I executed a flawless financial plan that rooted them out of the elite society they worshipped, and I walked away with their money to build an untouchable empire of my own.
The ultimate victory was never just about their destruction. It was about proving that my worth is defined entirely by my own intelligence and grit.
As the yacht cruised smoothly toward the golden horizon, I smiled. The absolute best revenge you can inflict upon your enemies is not just to see their downfall, but to live a life that is extraordinarily successful, deeply fulfilled, and completely beyond their reach. Thank you for listening to my story. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never let anyone convince you that you are not enough. The most powerful lesson this story conveys is that true strength lies in competence and emotional control, not in arrogance or belittling others. When faced with ultimate betrayal and public humiliation, Claire refused to engage in petty shouting matches. Instead, she relied entirely on her intelligence, her professional skills, and undeniable facts to ensure justice. Julian and Chloe built their fragile lives on deception and toxic vanity, which collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. Claire's journey reminds us that staying rooted in our own capabilities is what makes us truly untouchable.